This has been the longest, most difficult video I have ever made. Today I am giving you a chapter-by-chapter summary for Words of Radiance, Book 2 in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This video is a long time coming. About like 5 years ago now, I made a summary for The Way of Kings, and that is still one of the best videos on my channel. And to be honest, I kind of let the pressure get to me. That video took a lot of effort, and I ended up just not making any more summaries, but that's all going to change with this video, because with the upcoming release of Book 5, Wind and Truth, I plan on posting all the Stormlight Archive summaries. I'm a little bit behind already, but I want to post my Oathbringer summary in November, and then hopefully I'll have time to put up the Rhythm of War summary at the beginning of December. So then you can all be caught up for the release of Wind and Truth. Now again, this is not meant to be a quick recap. This is an in-depth summary. I'm going chapter by chapter, and I'm also pointing out some Easter eggs as well. I decided to not put a sponsor in this video. I wanted you guys just to dive in and enjoy it. That being said, this has been a massive undertaking. I mean, I have spent countless hours on this video. I don't know why I've put so much effort into this video. But that being said, if you do want to support the channel, if you enjoy these videos and you want to help me be able to make them faster, the best way to do that is by joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member, or even buy me a coffee on Ko-Fi. But you can also just subscribe and like the video if you're not able to help in those other kinds of ways. That is completely fine. And you could even comment below so that this video can defeat the algorithm. Now over on my Patreon, I will be releasing an audio only or podcast version of this video and all the summaries. That should be up right now actually, and that's completely ad-free if you just want to listen to the summary. Okay, and before getting into it, I do have a giveaway. In celebration of the upcoming release of Wind and Truth, Tor sent me this box that contains all 4 books in the Stormlight Archive to give away to one lucky winner. So if you happen to not have any physical copies and you want a chance to win all 4 books in the Stormlight Archive in these beautiful paperback editions, then make sure to click the link in the description to join the giveaway. And without further ado, we're going to dive into Words of Radiance. Now there is a minor spoiler warning here. I am going to cover some Cosmere Easter eggs. I will say none of these Easter eggs are really plot spoilers. They're mostly just things that you would likely miss out on if you weren't made aware of them, and if you haven't read the other Cosmere books, you're probably just gonna miss out on them. But even so, if you don't want to be spoiled, I do try to mention ahead of time when there's a Cosmere Easter egg so that you can skip ahead. Prologue to Question. Now, the prologue, like in the first book, starts us off 6 years ago during the night of King Gavilar's assassination, only this time we see it from Yasna's perspective. Now, Yasna slips away from the celebration and is heading to a secretive meeting that she arranged when she notices her shadow is pointing the wrong way, and it's not the first time this has happened to her. She wonders if she's cursed. A group of oily black figures materialize before her, and Yasna is then transferred to Shadesmar, the kingdom of the Spren, for the very first time. Now, she nearly drowns before discovering how to manipulate the beads into forming the shape of one of the palace hallways. One of the strange figures approaches her, drawing a sword, and Yasna creates a statue of Telenel to protect herself, but the figure bows to her, and suddenly Yasna is transferred back to the physical realm, where all the lanterns have been drained of stormlight. She continues on to her meeting, where she informs an assassin named Liss that she only wants Sudan, her sister-in-law, watched for now. And here we learn that Yasna is working as a spy master for House Kholin. Now, Liss is interesting. She's one of the most skilled assassins on Roshar and is known as the Weeper because she gouges out the eyes of her targets. And it's said that she does this to proclaim an indifference on whether her victims are light or dark-eyed. However, the heavily implied truth is that Liss doesn't want people knowing that she leaves the eyes burnt out because of her secret shard blade. Now, Liss also owned Szeth for a time, but sold him to the Parshendi just prior to the signing of the treaty. and because of her skills, Jasnah chooses to hire her as an observer rather than assassin. She offers to match the price of any offer made against a family member, and as she leaves, she overhears two men discussing someone named Ash, as well as something about a shard blade. Now, these two men are Nail and Kalak, two of the heralds of the Almighty. And this woman they call Ash is actually Shalash, the herald of beauty. And it seems like they're pretty concerned that one of their own is going around destroying images of her own face. It sounds like she's broken. Now, Jasnah here screams and navigates a hallway of carnage before reaching her father's rooms just as Szeth collapses the balcony, killing her father. Members of the Parshendi ruling council apologize and admit to hiring Szeth to assassinate King Gavilar in order to prevent something dangerous. And now we move on to part 1, A Light, which consists of 12 chapters and 4 interludes, starting from Shallan's perspective. The chapter opens with Shallan sketching Shadesmar as they sail south of Roshar on Tazbek's ship, the Wind's Pleasure, and while drawing, she notices a strange pattern manifesting in her sketch, a sequence of complex lines and sharp angles. This is the first physical appearance of pattern. She's startled, she drops her sketches, and then shortly after, a scout spots something in the water. A Xanthid, a massive and rare sea creature believed to bring good luck to sailors. Now, excited by the chance to draw the first ever picture of a living Xanthid, Shallan persuades the sailors to lower her over the side of the boat for a better view. And during this time when they're preparing, she discusses Shadesmar and Spren with Jasnah. And Jasnah informs Shallan that she's reached out to Navani about repairing the broken Soulcaster for her brothers to give back to the Ghostbloods. Oh, and additionally, Shallan learns that she's now betrothed to Adolin Kholin, a match that she willingly accepts. Now, Shallan is then lowered into the water, and we get the majestic view of the Xanthid beneath the shell, gnarled like an ancient tree and with long, drooping tendrils like those of a jellyfish. We see a mass of rippled and folded skin surrounding a massive eye that focuses directly on Shallan, and a group of strange arrow-shaped spren along with fish move through the water around the beast. She looked upon the creature, and its eye, as big as her head, rolled toward her, focusing, seeing her. In that moment, Shallan couldn't feel the cold. She couldn't feel embarrassed. She was looking into a world that, so far as she knew, no scholar had ever visited. The next chapter switches to Kaladin as he's experiencing his first high storm since being freed in the new barracks in Dalinar's war camp. And Kaladin ends up speaking with Scar and Teft and Moash about how to proceed training the roughly 1,000 new bridgemen. Now, he decides to personally train the most enthusiastic bridgemen, who will in turn go and teach the others. And his worst case scenario plan is to organize them into a mercenary band. Now captain of Dalinar's guard, Kaladin plans to promote his men, Rock as quartermaster and the Lopin as his second. Sigzil is going to be promoted to clerk, and himself, Scar, and Moash will be in charge of guarding Dalinar. Now later on, Kaladin and the former Bridge 4 members go to a tattooist in order to cover their slave brands with freedom tattoos, but Hobber insists they add the Bridge 4 glyph, not to mean they're freed from Bridge 4, but that they were freed by it. And even those without the brand, including Shen, get the tattoo, and it seems to form this sense of unity among them. Now, when Kaladin attempts to get this, the stormlight within him rejects the ink, causing it to melt away as soon as he reabsorbs the stormlight. Now, as a side note, Sanderson has confirmed that the reason Kaladin's healing process rejects the ink but leaves the scar behind is because the slave brand is tied closely to Kaladin's identity. He still sees himself as an escaped slave, and he still sees himself as dangerous. Now, surprisingly, the group receives salutes from several people as they pass. They end up going to the quartermaster and are given leftover Cobalt Guard uniforms. Kaladin makes a request for new Bridge 4 glyph patches to be added to the uniforms, which reinforces that sense of unity, and they wear them proudly, identifying as Bridge 4. Now, back to Shallan. She's reading a book written by Jasnah about Vorinism and the Recreants, and how historical records, including the existence of Shadesmar, have been altered. As she studies, the pattern appears again. It vanishes when she looks directly at it, but she recognizes its similarity to the symbol-headed creatures that she's seen before. Now intrigued, Shallan tries to sketch it, drawing the attention of Creation Spren, but capturing its exact form is pretty much impossible. Now Jasnah arrives at her room and Shallan catches a glimpse of what Jasnah identifies as her own Spren. Jasnah then explains that pattern is Shallan Spren, a cryptic Spren, and she introduces her to the concept of the Knights Radiant and their different orders, explaining that while both of them can soulcast, their Spren and thus their orders are different, and they share a lengthy discussion about the nature of Spren, the Radiance, and Jasnah's critical views of the Almighty and the Heralds. Chapter 4 finally switches us over to Dalinar, who's experiencing another cryptic vision. He finds himself running across what he believes to be the Pure Lake, alongside a dozen men clad in ancient leather armor. Now unsure if they're fleeing or pursuing something, they soon reach an Onyx fortress, and there they meet another group that's led by a Knight Radiant in glowing red shardplate, confirming that the vision takes place before the Recreants. The Radiant warns them to watch for Spren behaving strangely, noting that Spren touched by Saja Anat are different. He ends up noticing a female Knight Radiant speaking to what seems like empty air, and then he sees a face in the water with red eyes and a shadowy form, identifying it as one of Saja Anat's spies. The Spren is suddenly joined by a larger 6-foot-tall Spren, and the second Spren dives into the rock, causing the ground to tremble. Dalinar is pulled back as the rock itself comes to life, forming a thunderclast. The soldiers call for hammers as they prepare to fight the towering creature, and the Almighty then speaks with Dalinar about the Knights Radiant, saying,
"I was surprised when these orders arrived. I did not teach my heralds this. It was the Spren wishing to imitate what I had given men who made it possible. You will need to refound them. This is your task. Unite them. Create a fortress that can weather the storm. Vex Odium, convince him that he can lose, and appoint a champion. He will take that chance instead of risking defeat again, as he has suffered so often. This is the best advice I can give you."
Now Dalinar agrees to refound the Knights Radiant, and he's basically been realizing that the Almighty is dead, and he's kind of scrambling to hold on to some type of belief, and he decides that because the Almighty is dead, and because he failed to foresee the coming of the Knights Radiant, the Almighty could not have been God. God, as Dalinar constructs him, must be omniscient and omnipotent. I imagine this upheaval of what he believed in would be a very hard thing to process. Now, Dalinar awakens to find Navani recording his cryptic words and the details of his vision, revealing that he's even been speaking a different language. They discuss Dalinar's upcoming proclamation as High Prince of War, and Navani convinces him to inform the other High Princes privately before making the news public. Exhausted by the weight of his responsibilities, Dalinar falls asleep by the fire, but when he awakes, he notices fresh glyphs scratched into the wall, reading 62 days. Death follows. Moving over to Kaladin and Bridge 4, who are listening to Dalinar's new decree, which states that all gem hearts won in a battle will now belong to the king, with shares distributed at the crown's discretion, and this is bound to piss off a lot of the High Princes, making Kaladin and the boys' job much more difficult as Dalinar's bodyguards. To keep up morale, Kaladin instructs Rock to begin training cooks for the other Bridgeman barracks, and Syl expresses concern that Kaladin never laughs anymore, and he refuses to be happy even when things are getting better, which he explains as the pressure of increased responsibilities. They talk about ideals, life before death, strength before weakness, journey before destination was the first ideal, and Kaladin's figured out that the second ideal is an oath to protect those who could not protect themselves. But Syl says she won't won't tell him the other 3, and that he'll know them when he needs to. Now I should note, at the beginning of the chapter we got some artwork illustrated by Isaac Stewart that depicts the Bridge 4 tattoos and Kaladin's brands, and it's attributed to Naz. Now this is a Cosmere Easter egg. Naz, or Nazriloth, is a world hopper from Threnody, who seems to be going around the Cosmere collecting graphics to share with his employer Chris. He's also kind of a map maker, and Chris, or Chrysilla, is another world hopper from the planet Taldane from Whitesand, and she's the author of the Ars Arcanum, which is in the back of each book. Now if you pay attention, you're going to see her name pop up in a lot of the Cosmere, and you're going to see Naz pop up as well. And the Arcanum Unbounded gives us a lot more information about Chris, but she's still very mysterious. Anyway, during this chapter, we begin to see the hatred and arrogance that's hiding under Moash's good soldier act, as Kaladin has to talk to him about his attitude. Later, at the king's palace, Kaladin attends a meeting with Dalinar, King Elokar, and a bunch of other Light Eyes. Basically, the report is that the High Princes are furious over the proclamation, and Elokar thinks it's a complete disaster, and he doesn't think they're going to survive the week. Dalinar, however, stands firm, stating that his goal is to unite the kingdom or die trying. He wants them angry to remind them why they came to the Shattered Plains to begin with, and he ends up revealing his plan to disarm the High Princes by having Adolin duel for their shard blades and shardplate. When asked about his endgame, Dalinar admits that he wants to refound the Knights Radiant, though he doesn't fully understand why. Now, in regards to the strange glyphs that are carved into his wall, Kaladin feels like a fool for somehow letting someone break in, while Dalinar secretly believes that he did it himself. And then we also get a brief point of view from Sadeas, who reflects on his acquisition of Oathbringer, Dalinar's shardblade, which he's coveted for a long time, but now he feels hollow about possessing it. His wife Iole informs Sadeas that she's used Dalinar's recruitment drive to place more spies in his war camp. Sadeas plans to let Dalinar alienate the High Princes and fracture the kingdom, then conquer what remains, forging a new Elethkar from flame and tears. Now on the deck of the Wind's Pleasure, Shallan explains the concept of food to Pattern. Shallan is noticing that her Spren is becoming more capable of understanding complex thoughts, and they end up discussing lies for a while, and Pattern specifically enjoys a true lie. Now Pattern also loves abstractions, words or phrases that are truer than they are real, and we also discover that Pattern's been with her for a long time. He was even with her way back in Yakaved. She asks him about his first memories, and to this he begins to vibrate, and Shallan can hear wind blowing through branches, and she sees a vision of the deck turning into a dirt path, and she pictures her father's garden, with Pattern on the ground drawn in the dust. Pattern then tries to get her to remember the past that she's repressing, but she's trained herself to recoil at the thought, and the entire vision vanishes. Now, Yalb interrupts and introduces her to a new sailor. Later in the cabin, she notices that oddly her spheres have gone done, so she heads over to Yasna, who's unusually very exhausted and troubled, and they end up discussing the resurgence of surge binding, and Yasna advises Shallan to focus on mastering the illumination surge rather than soul casting, which can be dangerous. Yasna also expresses her growing concern that the Parshmen are actually Voidbringers, and their deep integration into Vorin society could lead to a disaster if they rebel. She explains that in ancient times, the Heralds would return before Desolations in order to train the Knights Radiant, and she reveals her hope of finding a path to Urithiru, the lost city of the Radiance, which she believes to be somewhere in the Shattered Plains, and there she hopes to uncover evidence to convince the Alethi leadership to expel the Parshmen. Before leaving, Jasnah gives Shallan a book on the Order of Lightweavers titled Words of Radiance, and Shallan plans on reading it in the morning, but her rest is abruptly cut short by screams, shouts, and the smell of smoke. She rushes out of her cabin only to witness a horrifying scene. 3 men with torches stand over Jasnah's body, and one of them stabs her through the heart. She recognizes one of the men as the new sailor who she was introduced to. Shocked and terrified, Shallan runs to her cabin and locks the door, and as the men try to break in, Pattern tries to convince her to summon her blade and fight. But clearly she's still trying to repress her memories of ever using a shard blade, and so she chooses to use her new power of illusion. She draws in stormlight and hides by creating an illusion of shadow, while projecting a moving image to lure them away. Pattern informs her the other sailors are being murdered on the main deck, so desperate to help, Shallan plans on soulcasting the bottom of the ship to sink it and create enough chaos to save the remaining sailors. Pattern guides her into Shadesmar, and here we see Pattern's true appearance of a symbol head. She finds the bead representing the wind's pleasure and convinces it to change. And upon returning to the physical realm, she sees it begin sinking. However, she struggles to find a way out, and just as she's being pulled under the water, something grabs her and drags her down. And then it moves to Chapter 8. Dalinar watches as High Prince Aladar's army battles the Parshendi for a gem heart, arriving at the plateau before his own forces. Kaladin and his guards cross a bridge to protect Dalinar as he joins Aladar on a command plateau. Now, while Adolin is down there leading the forces into the fight, Dalinar advises Aladar, telling him that he saved him from defeat. But Aladar, frustrated, complains that his success means he'll earn less, and he feels punished. When Dalinar threatens the consequences of disobedience, Aladar retorts that Gavilar didn't unite the kingdom through honor. He did it with knives in the back and soldiers on the field, cutting the heads off any who resisted. This strikes a nerve with Dalinar. Now, eventually, the Kholin forces claim victory, but Dalinar notices a Parshendi shardbearer watching from afar, never entering the fray. A new and troubling development. Back in his bunker, Dalinar reflects on the mysterious countdown, realizing there's only 60 days left. He receives a letter announcing that an old friend will soon arrive on the Shattered Plains, possibly offering a solution to his growing problems. Later on, Kaladin leads a large group of bridgemen down into the chasms for spear training, with those chosen to become future sergeants practicing the spear under Tef's guidance. Now, Kaladin and Syl drift away from the group and they discuss physics, with Syl claiming that she can defy gravity. Syl mentions that she's been seeing dangerous red spren, which concerns Kaladin. He asks her if there's other surge binders, and Syl confirms that there are, but notes that she's the only honor spren who defied the Stormfather to bond with him. She encourages Kaladin to become what Dalinar is looking for, and despite his painful past, Kaladin agrees to try, but he still doesn't believe that he's becoming a Radiant. And he's afraid the Light Eyes will find some way to take Syl from him. Now, while Syl knows there's other spren out there trying to reclaim what was lost, she's frustrated that she can't remember what she knows. They're interrupted by Rock, who praises Syl and jokes about building a shrine for her. He informs Kaladin that Teft has moved the training to a different spot and that the bridgemen are starting to embrace their new roles. And Kaladin agrees to let Sigzil test the limits of his abilities. In Chapter 10, we get a flashback 6 years ago. Shallan, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, believes the world is ending and blames herself. Her father tries to comfort her, singing a lullaby and wiping blood from her face. However, Shallan feels unworthy of his love, convinced she's a monster who kills. In the room with them lie 2 corpses. One is a man who has bled out, and the other is Shallan's mother, dressed in white and lying face down, concealing her horrible eyes. As Shallan and her father walk past a safe in the wall, she glimpses a glowing light from the monster inside it. After finishing the lullaby, her father leaves the room, closing the door on the corpses, leaving Shallan alone with her haunting memories. Now back in the present, Shallan wakes up on a rock near the shore, and she watches the Xanthid, the sea creature that saved her, swim off toward the horizon. Now Pattern informs her that the wind's pleasure has sunk, and he isn't sure if anyone has survived. Devastated, Shallan forces herself to accept that Yasna is dead. Now Pattern urges her to follow him, leading her to Yasna's trunk, which contains her mentor's books and notes, conveniently preserved in a waterproof case. Now desperate to build a fire but unable to do so, Pattern guides her into Shadesmar, and here she notices large bird-like spren surrounding her, which are exhaustion spren. She then tries to convince a bead representing a piece of wood to become fire. She pleads with it, she tries to convince it that it wants to burn, but it resists, and it prefers to remain a stick.
I am a stick.
Now, obviously, the argument that she used with the ship was far more compelling. She was asking the ship to sacrifice itself to save the lives of those who served it so well. For the stick, there's no reason to become fire and then cease to exist. Also, side note, if you missed it, I made a theory video on Stick being a world hopper, so maybe give that a watch if you haven't yet. Drained of stormlight and failing to create the fire, Shallan is forced to leave Shadesmar. Now she's injured and exhausted, and she begins walking, her feet cut and bleeding, and eventually she stumbles upon a group of strangers around a fire. Too tired to speak, she collapses by the fire and falls asleep. When she awakes, a man with a Thaylen accent addresses her as Brightness and introduces himself as Tivlakiv. Now, Tivlakiv is a slaver, and you may remember this is the same slaver who brought Kaladin to the Shattered Plains back in the Way of Kings. Channeling Yasna's confidence, Shallan asserts herself, introducing herself with authority and ordering them to retrieve Yasna's trunk and escort her to the Shattered Plains, and they reluctantly agree to her commands. Now, another thing to note, for this chapter, the book provides this map that's again illustrated by Isaac Stewart, and the in-story cartographer is none other than our friend Naz. He's pointing out where Shallan made landfall, again collecting information for the scholar Chris. But to what end? Your guess is as good as mine. Now moving back to Kaladin down in the chasms, Sigzil is finally getting the opportunity to measure Kaladin's abilities. Along with Rock and the Lopen, they run a series of tests to assess Kaladin's control over Stormlight. Lopen is a man with simple tastes, and he wants to fly, and if he can't fly, he wants to walk on walls. But Kaladin sadly crushes his dreams by saying he can't do either of those, so they start by infusing a rock with Stormlight and sticking it to a chasm wall, in order to see how long it stays in place. Now, Rock mentions tiny spren pulling the stone to the wall, and Kaladin glimpses them too, though Sigzil can't see them. I love how Sigzil is trying his very best to apply the scientific method to this magic nonsense, and as they move on to testing how Kaladin's abilities can be applied in combat, such as infusing his spear to stick to an enemy's weapon, or infusing the ground to unbalance his opponents, Lopen and Rock assist as sparring partners, revealing that Rock, while skilled in combat, still refuses to fight seriously outside of the tests. Now Teft arrives and he wants Kaladin to release him from being a trainer, but Kaladin refuses, knowing that Teft's experience is invaluable. As they leave the chasm, a dark-eyed soldier approaches Kaladin with news that a hero has arrived at Dalinar's war camp. And when Kaladin hears the man's name, he rushes ahead and sees Dalinar warmly clasping the hands of his old friend, Bright Lord Amaram. The same Bright Eyes who betrayed Kaladin, killed his friends, and got him branded as a slave. We then get the first 4 interludes. In Interlude 1, after successfully retrieving a gem heart, Eshonai leads the Parshendi, or the Listeners as they call themselves, to their home plateau at the center of the Shattered Plains, Narak. Now we learn a lot about the Parshendi culture in this interlude, including their forms and their rhythms. Eshonai reflects on her inability to fight due to an injury that Kaladin gave her during the Battle of the Tower, and she also feels a very strong urge to speak with Dalinar, noting how she hasn't spotted the Blackthorn since the last time about a week ago. Now as she wanders through the ruins of Narak, where her people fled to escape their gods, she enters the Hall of Art and contemplates the 6 known forms of the Parshendi and mourns the loss of hundreds of forms that are mentioned in their ancient songs, worrying that their people may not survive without discovering new forms. She reflects on the decision to assassinate Gavilar in order to prevent the return of their gods, knowing that it may doom her people in the long run. Eshonai then meets with her sister Venli, who reveals that she has discovered Storm Form, which she says could summon the Parshendi gods. Now Eshonai is alarmed, but Venli argues that the Alethi now have Surge Binders, so they must risk Storm Form in order to survive. Venli proposes that they should take this idea to the Five, and Eshonai, while hesitant, agrees to consider it. In Interlude 2, we follow Yim, a humble cobbler who's working in his shop carving wooden shoe forms. A mysterious spren resembling tiny specks of light and growing like small plants has been visiting him more frequently. Now the spren suddenly warns he comes, and anxious, Yim looks for a military-coated watcher, but instead finds a poor limping child at his door. The child, an Iriali with golden skin and hair, but covered in dirt, looks like a street urchin, and Yim invites him in and offers him some shoes in exchange for his story. And as the boy talks, Yim cleans his feet and subtly uses some stormlight in order to heal a nasty cut, all while explaining his religious beliefs revolving around the Iriali god known as the One. Now, according to this belief, the One knew everything but had experienced nothing, and so the One became many in order to experience all things. Every person is a different mind of a single being experiencing different lives. Eventually, all will be gathered back in when the sum of land is attained, and they will once again become one. Now, as a side note, this belief could be related to the shattering of Adonalsium, or it at least shares a similar philosophy. Go watch my lore deep dive on the origins of the Cosmere if you want to learn more about the shattering of Adonalsium. Now, after fitting the child with new shoes, the spren whispers that the danger is still present. Suddenly, a dark-skinned man with a crescent scar steps from the shadows. Nail. He accuses Yim of committing a murder in his youth. Now, Yim insists it was unintentional, but the man declares him guilty and summons a shard blade. Yim tries to flee, but is too old and slow. The man catches him, slams him against a wall, and stabs him in the chest with the shard blade, ending his life. Clearly, Nail, one of the 10 heralds, is looking for any justification to kill Surge Binders. Moving to Interlude 3, Rissyn travels with her mentor Vistim to the Reshi Isle for trade, but Vistim is too ill to negotiate. Now Rissyn discovers the shifting islands are actually giant great shells. Nervous but determined, she ascends the island and along the way encounters Axes the Collector, who's hanging from his ankles as punishment for offending the Reshi religion. Now you may remember Axes from an interlude in Book 1. He's on a quest to catalog all the different varieties of spren on Roshar, and being Aemean, he can magically modify his skin and is pretty much immortal. Eventually, the king agrees to negotiate with Rissyn, but she's surprised when she sees the king is a woman. However, the Reshi are very hesitant and uncertain if they can trust her, and eventually they dismiss her. But Rissyn decides to be bold and to plead with the Great Shell Reluna for assistance in securing the trade. She slides down the creature's head on a rope, but when the rope snaps, she falls and is cushioned by the Great Shell but loses consciousness. When she awakes, her legs are paralyzed, and Vistim and the others scold her for her recklessness, but Rissyn insists it was a bold move to ensure the trade. She then learns that Vistim had orchestrated the entire situation in order to test her, and as a reward, she's granted a live Larkin by the island, instead of the Larkin corpse that her Bapsk initially sought. Now, a Larkin is a highly sought after and critically endangered species of flying crustacean animals native to Amia. Rissyn and Vistim decide to remain on the island while her legs heal. Interlude 4 brings us back to Eshonai, who's examining a gemstone containing a storm spren. She's concerned about invoking the old gods, but others seem to think they need any advantage they can get. After leaving the meeting, Eshonai visits a group of Parshendi who have adopted doll form to avoid being targeted by the Alethi, and she reflects on the Parshendi's freedom to choose their forms now that they're no longer ruled by the gods. Eshonai then visits her mother, who suffers from dementia and mistakes Eshonai for her sister Venli. Despite her mother's confusion, Eshonai gathers valuable historical information about the Parshendi's rejection of the old gods. Her mother recounts the story of the last legion, who gave up knowledge of the powerful forms in exchange for their freedom, leaving them with only doll form and mate form. These ancient Parshendi composed songs to preserve the memory of lost forms, hoping they might one day be rediscovered. Before leaving, her mother gives her some old maps from her exploring days. Now, Eshonai then attends a meeting with the Five in order to discuss Venli's Stormform proposal. Now, although hesitant, Eshonai ultimately agrees to the plan, but on the condition that she be the first to attempt Stormform. Venli's crucial role in their studies makes her too valuable to risk. Now, all throughout part 1, with each chapter, we've been getting these epigraphs that contain fragments from Navani's diary. I'll collect them all on the screen here if you want to pause and read them, but basically, in hindsight, she feels guilty and blames herself for not noticing the changes with the Parshendi. And now begins part 2, Wind's Approach, which covers chapters 13 to 34 and interludes 5 to 8. Shallan continues her journey toward the Shattered Plains on one of the slavers' wagons. She talks with Pattern, who mentions how she didn't break, but only cracked, and it's her lies that saved her and drew him to her. He also says, "I will not stop vibrating, the wind will not stop blowing, you will not stop drawing." Now at this point, it's clear that Pattern is no longer a confused Roomba. He's really growing a lot and getting better at speech and thought. Later, Shallan sits beside Bluth, a stoic mercenary, and to distract herself, she observes the unfamiliar flora of the southern Frostlands. Tvlakiv converts an empty slave wagon into a makeshift carriage for her, and inside, Shallan, struggling with painful injured feet, opens Yasna's trunk and resolves to complete Yasna's mission, finding Urithiru and warning the Alethi about the impending Voidbringers. Pattern confirms that the Voidbringer threat is real and part of why he was sent to Shallan. As she sorts through the trunk, she finds a sketch of Yasna and is overwhelmed with grief for her mentor. She also mourns the loss of her other sketches and the Soulcaster, which now lie at the bottom of the ocean. Shallan speculates that the attackers may have been linked to the Ghostbloods, the same group as Capsule and her father. And then it ends with a pretty chilling statement by Pattern, who says, Spren of him, they come." In chapter 15, curious about his intentions, Shallan asks Pattern to spy on a conversation between Tvlakiv and Tag. Now, Pattern replays the conversation, revealing Tvlakiv's plan to protect Shallan, but also profit from her rescue in order to settle a debt. Armed with this knowledge, Shallan keeps Tvlakiv off balance, warning him not to play games when he expresses doubt about her story of wealth and betrothal. As she leaves, she realizes she's glowing faintly with stormlight, giving her a majestic appearance, which she hopes Tvlakiv attributes to the campfire's light. Bluth returns to camp in a panic, dousing the fire and informing them that he spotted a nearby caravan of potential bandit deserters. They quickly pack and head east to avoid confrontation. Switching over to Adolin as he's preparing for his first duel under Dalinar's plan. Adolin talks to his Shardblade and confides that he's not as confident as everyone thinks he appears. He then thanks his shard blade for all it's done for him, and after all his pre-dueling rituals, Renarin and Navani help him equip his shard plate. Now Navani burns a prayer glyph for safety, and Adolin asks about Yasna. Navani reassures him that her daughter has likely gone missing due to a change in plans, but will return. And Renarin questions why Adolin is so bothered by Kaladin when he saved Dalinar's life. In the arena, Adolin faces Salinor in front of a large crowd, the first formal duel in over a year. Initially using Wind Stance, Adolin recalls his father's advice and switches to Iron Stance, aggressively overpowering Salinor. Treating his opponent like a new recruit, he feels the thrill during this battle, something that he hasn't felt before. Now, despite protest from a high judge for using hand-to-hand combat to break Salinor's helm and breastplate, Adolin is proclaimed the winner, and he gives the shard blade to Renarin as a present. Switching to Kaladin, he's leading a bodyguard patrol with Moash and Drehi through the Light Eyes training ground while waiting for Adolin and Renarin. Moash brings up Kaladin's feelings about Amaram, saying they will eventually get revenge on the Light Eyes who wronged them. Kaladin confides in Syl that he believes Dalinar is honorable but deceived by Amaram, and Syl advises him to tell Dalinar the truth about how Amaram obtained the shard blade, but Kaladin doubts that he'll be believed. When Renarin and Adolin arrive, Adolin confronts Kaladin for his attitude, but Kaladin says his duty is only to protect him. And Syl expresses how she dislikes both of them because they carry shard blades, which she considers abominations. Kaladin notices a suspicious figure watching them, and this is where we meet Zahel, an ex-soldier ardent who's wearing odd clothing, and Kaladin notes that his eyes look ancient, but his face doesn't match, so he can't pin his age. Now Zahel assures Kaladin that he means the brothers no harm, and then he's summoned by Adolin to join the Ardents. Kaladin asks Syl if Zahel seems odd. "You all seem odd to me, everyone but Rock, who is a complete gentleman. He thinks you're a god. You shouldn't encourage him." "Why not? I am a god." Syl: "What? I am. A little piece of one. Very, very little. You have permission to bow to me now." Now later, Kaladin and Lopin guard Adolin and Renarin during their training with Zahel. Lopin is eating something called chowda, a flatbread wrapped with meat and some type of sauce, and for some reason Kaladin turns his nose up at this, which honestly I don't understand. This sounds mouth-watering to me. Now after the Lopin leaves, Kaladin watches Zahel instruct Renarin to jump off a roof in his shard plate to build confidence. Zahel offers to train Kaladin, who declines. Instead, the Swordmaster tests Kaladin's abilities with a blunted shard blade to ensure that he's prepared to protect Adolin and Renarin. Now in the mock duel, Zahel defeats him, though Kaladin feels that he at least proved enough cover for Renarin to escape. Adolin makes a snide remark, which enrages Kaladin to attack him, and Adolin strikes Kaladin with a shard plate enhanced punch, severely injuring him. Kaladin secretly heals himself with Stormlight and attempts another attack, but quickly runs out of strength and collapses. Zahel compliments Kaladin's resilience, but warns that it won't be enough against shard bearers. And when Kal asks Syl why he lost his strength, she observes it happened because he wasn't protecting anyone during the fight. If he wants to be a Radiant, he has to do it right. Now meanwhile, Shallan is sketching plants, the Xanthid, and even sketching her first person since the shipwreck, the mercenary Bluth, but idealized as a spearman in an army, and she shows him her artwork, not as he is, but as he once might have been, a hero. She then notices smoke on the horizon, signaling the deserters are still pursuing them. Tivlakiv reassures her that the deserters will likely give up if the caravan keeps moving. However, she soon spots another column of smoke, and Tivlakiv speculates that it could be a different caravan. Shallan orders him to head towards it. She talks to Pattern about light weaving and the Knights Radiant, with Pattern revealing that Shallan has spoken oaths, marking her path toward becoming a Radiant. Now, Sanderson has said that she spoke most or perhaps all of her her oaths when she was younger, but nearly broke her bond due to the trauma of what happened on that night. Now we learn the symbiotic relationship formed by the bond gives the human the ability to control two of the natural surges of the world, and it gives the Spren sapience, ideas that live and think. The Spren acquire the ability to manifest, communicate, and interact in the physical realm, while the human acquire the ability to control and interact in the cognitive realm. But then we learn that the Knights Radiant killed their Spren, and it's hinted that the Knights didn't realize what would happen to the Spren when their oaths were broken. Pattern, referring to the Recreants, says it happened to the others. It will happen to me. It is a pattern. And suddenly Shallan notices burning wagons ahead, and that's where chapter 18 ends. But in this chapter, we got this beautiful artwork of Pattern from Shallan's sketchbook, with a note at the bottom from, you guessed it, Naz. He says, "You have no idea what I went through to recover this from the bottom of the Rosharan Ocean. You owe me a new coat." Why was Naz retrieving Shallan's luggage? Did Chris ever give him that new coat? Who knows? Before continuing, we get a brief flashback 5.5 years ago. Shallan, now old enough to wear a silk dress covering her safe hand, overhears maids gossiping, mentioning how she hasn't spoken in 5 months after witnessing her father kill her mother and her lover. Shallan wonders if people think she is invisible because she stays silent. Her brother Helleran bursts in with a gift of charcoal pencils and expensive paper, encouraging her to draw again. He asks her to stay strong and take care of their brothers. He then sees her drawing dead bodies, and he stops her and tells her to draw nice things. Their father, Lindavar, enters, and he and Helleran argue. Helleran accuses their father of murder and summons a shard blade that no one knew he had. Lyn tries to explain, mentioning their mother, but Helleran cuts him off, and Shallan quietly says no. Shocked from hearing her speak, Helleran stops himself from running the blade through their father's chest, and warns Lyn that he'll be checking on the family, but says he has important work to do, and again reminds Shallan to draw happy things. Back to the present, Shallan's caravan reaches the source of the smoke and finds the remains of burned wagons and corpses from a recent battle. A woman from the other caravan confronts them, mocking Shallan's offer of protection since they're caught between two enemy groups. Shallan disguises herself as a noble and persuades the deserters to help fight the other bandits, offering to pardon their crimes and give them a fresh start. Now, one of these deserters is none other than Gaz, the petty, cruel, and bitter bridge sergeant who oversaw all the bridgemen in the Way of Kings. However, it's clear that he's been going through some personal growth and reflection here. Vatha, the leader of the deserters, initially scoffs at this offer, but his followers are intrigued and they charge into battle, with Gaz leading the charge. Eventually, Shallan convinces Vatha and the rest to join as well. Now, we also meet Tin, a light-eyes woman with a long coat and sword, and she's amused at what Shallan is doing because she can see through the lies. Having used up all of her stormlight, Shallan stays out of the fight, and Pattern praises her ability to inspire people without soul casting. Eventually, the bandits are defeated, but unfortunately, Bluth dies during this battle just as he was beginning to warm up to Shallan, and when she examines his body, she finds her stolen drawing of him, and she changes her mind, deciding that Bluth wasn't a bad way to restart her collection after all. She convinces the caravan owner Makab to accompany her to the Shattered Plains. Vatha confronts her, questioning why she no longer appears radiant as she was before, and he's very skeptical of what's going on here. Eventually, Pattern intervenes and tricks Vatha to back off. However, Tivlakiv accuses Shallan of a conspiracy involving Bluth and her working together with the deserters all along, but she denies it and calls him an oily little man, demanding the non-Parshman slaves as payment. She then frees the slaves, but gives an offer to hire some of them as servants. A sheet of paper with a prayer to the Almighty is handed to Gaz, and when the deserters turn around, they see 24 people, some with thankful tears on their cheeks and children in their arms, and they don't quite know how to react. Suddenly, they're seen as heroes. They see the gratitude of those they saved right up close and personal, and they stand a little taller for it as they burn the prayer. Now back to Kaladin. During a high storm in King Elokar's quarters, Kaladin sees a strange reddish glow, but it vanishes before he can investigate. Dalinar and Navani are in a side room, and Kaladin examines a heating fabrial developed by Navani, and he and Adolin argue about whether his protection is necessary during the storm, which Elokar sides with Kaladin. After the storm, Dalinar checks for mysterious numbers on the walls, but doesn't find any, and he then talks with Adolin about difficulty securing the duels. Kaladin thinks that the Shard Bearers might be boycotting Adolin, and Dalinar agrees, stating they need to undermine Sadeas. And then later, Kaladin privately tells Dalinar about Amaram's betrayal and how he obtained his Shard Blade. Now, Dalinar is kind of shocked. He tries asking for proof, and Kaladin mentions witnesses. Dalinar urges Kaladin to stay silent for now, but he promises to investigate it, but also reprimands him for his insubordination. Privately, Kaladin tells Syl that Dalinar's not going to do anything, and he vows to handle it himself. Syl worries about him, and she warns him that he's not a Skybreaker. And then back at the barracks, Kaladin meets a new Herdazian crew member, apparently a cousin of Lopin, and Shen confronts Kaladin about being forbidden to carry weapons, claiming he's being treated like a slave, and this actually disturbs Kaladin. But then suddenly, one of the palace guards rushes in with news of an assassin targeting the king. Kaladin then returns to the king's quarters, but finds everyone safe with no immediate danger. He and Moash inspect the balcony where Elokar had nearly fallen, and he discovers a railing joint was cut clean through, indicating sabotage by a shard blade. Dalinar concludes it must be an inside job and assigns Kaladin to guard Elokar immediately, though Kaladin finds Elokar's complaints frustrating and sees him as lacking composure, but he resolves to focus on his duty of protecting the king rather than judging him. For some reason, Dalinar has a lot of trust in Kaladin, so he orders him to find men only from the bridge crews to form a new Kingsguard. Now back to Shallan, some of the men, including Gaz, share their stories of why they deserted, and Vatha mocks Gaz for being too submissive to Shallan, who in turn defends Gaz, arguing that the deserters have redeemed themselves. And when Shallan asks Gaz about his debt, he avoids the topic and walks away. Now later, she studies Yasna's notes on the Shattered Plains and Urithiru. Frustrated by the lack of objectivity in historical records, Pattern tells her that truth is subjective, and they end up discussing Spren and Voidbringers, and Pattern reveals that Voidbringers have Spren. He also mentions the shards, honor, cultivation, and odium, speaking nervously about that last one. Later on, Shallan is summoned to dine with Tin, who questions Shallan's identity. Tin concludes that Shallan is a fellow con artist, and she offers to help her with the scam. And so Shallan plays along, hinting that she has dangerous secrets about Dalinar Kholin. Speaking of Dalinar, in the next chapter, Dalinar orders Kaladin and Bridge 4 to learn horseback riding for faster mobility around the camp, and despite Moash's distrust of Dalinar, he eagerly agrees because he can see the battlefield advantage that horses provide. The stable master Jeanette gives them a lecture on horsemanship, and she throws rocks at Adolin when he tries to flirt. Kaladin then questions one of the guards about Elokar's near fall and realizes the sabotage must have occurred after the high storm. Natim, the guard, says, "I was with the guys who ran out there and found him flapping in the wind like the Storm Father's own ears." It turns out horses are way too smart for Kaladin's liking, and he's honestly kind of scared of them. Adolin then taunts him for riding children's training mounts, and Kaladin decides he needs to ride something more suitable for war, an untamed horse named Dreamstorm. Cal manages to use Stormlight to lash himself to the saddle, resulting in him being whipped around like a limp cloth until the horse tires, and then eventually he's still thrown off when his Stormlight depletes. However, it does manage to shock and secretly impress Adolin with how long he lasted. Dalinar then assigns Kaladin and his men to patrol outside the camps using their horses, and Natim mentions seeing Moash on the balcony after the storm, but Kal dismisses him as a suspect, and then later he grows angry when he sees Dalinar chatting with Amaram. Now in the next chapter, Adolin and his light-eyed friend Yakimov lead a charge against the Parshendi to capture a gem heart, but are too late. Eshonai has already taken the gem heart and sent it away. Eshonai then asks Adolin to pass along her request for a parley with Dalinar. Now Adolin checks on his brother and he learns that Renarin tried to join the battle but had one of his fits after summoning his shard blade. Yakimov warns Adolin that he'll eventually lose a duel and reveals that Sadeas has been bribing people to refuse. He suggests maybe challenging Araniv, but when Adolin asks to talk about his personal struggles over drinks, Yakimov, once a friend, declines, saying it's not good for one's reputation to be seen with him due to Dalinar's actions. Renarin then tells his brother that he didn't have a fit on the battlefield, it was just fear, and then cryptically he warns that they need to be prepared for the coming storm. We then get a flashback 5 years ago. Shallan sketches in the estate garden, longing for the peace that it offers, though she knows it's an artificial calm. Hearing shouting from the manor, she tenses and ruins her sketch. Lost in thought, she stares at a blank page until the sky darkens. As she heads inside for another of her father's frequent feasts, she wonders if her father resents that she's begun speaking again, fearing that she might reveal what she's seen. Her mind goes blank again, but her brother, Jushu, disheveled and drunk, finds her on the stairs and tells her that their brother Balat has been starting fires again, almost burning down the servants' building. As they pass their father's quarters, Shallan glimpses the glowing outline of a strongbox hidden behind a painting. Jushu dismisses her concerns, but Shallan stares at the light, convinced that a monster and her mother's soul lurks inside. Now back in the present, Tin gives Shallan advice on being a con artist as they practice a Bavlander accent. However, Shallan senses tension when Tin talks about her latest mission ending poorly. The caravan encounters 4 uniformed horse riders, and Tin introduces Shallan as a horn-eater princess. Shallan plays along, and one of the riders just so happens to be Kaladin, who explains they're patrolling the area for the Alethi king. Now Kal comments that Shallan looks too thin to be a horn-eater, and Shallan pretends to be offended and she demands his boots in compensation, which he reluctantly gives over. I mean, at this point, Shallan has really been wanting boots, but she does feel bad afterward about taking them from the rider. Now, we then get another chapter starting from the point of view of Sadeas, who savors the thrill after a battle, though it fades too soon. Amaram expresses desire for peace with Dalinar and Elhokar, but Sadeas insists Amaram is as ruthless as he is, even if Amaram claims to focus on the bigger picture. Sadeas is annoyed that despite his efforts, Adolin found another dueling opponent. And as Adolin is dueling Araniv down below, Sadeas and Ialai discuss the failed assassination attempt on Elhokar and its implications, with Sadeas planning to expose Dalinar as a hypocrite for excluding him from the investigation. He intends to resign as High Prince of Information. Looking down below, he realizes Adolin is cleverly pretending to struggle in the duel, and with the intention to exploit Adolin's temper, he tells Ialai to stop blocking the duels. Now back to Shallan, who has the caravan stop to investigate a small rock overhang with a small diverse ecosystem of plants and animals. Now Gaz joins her and asks for a portrait, and Shallan sketches him with slight enhancements, making him look more impressive and noble, and Gaz is very grateful for the portrait. As they prepare to camp for the night, Pattern warns Shallan of impending trouble. She continues drawing, making strange sketches without thinking, one of which being a sketch of these shadowy figures helping themselves out of the water, and one of them is Yalb, the friendly sailor on the Wind's Pleasure. This seems to hint that some of the sailors survived. The other sketch is a mysterious scene of a woman chiseling the face of a statue. Now, unaware to Shallan, this is a depiction of Shalash, the Herald of Beauty, who's traveling the world, destroying any depiction of herself that she can find. Now this oddly seems like Shallan's sketches are almost prophetic or clairvoyant in nature. Talking to Tin, Shallan remains committed to their scam, revealing her plan to impersonate Adolin Kholin's betrothed. Shallan is torn between her research on Urithiru and her fake role as Adolin's fiancé, while also wondering what to do with Tin when the truth comes out. Now later, Tin watches Shallan practice sleight of hand and pushes her to work on her accents and let go of her prudishness. The caravan stops outside the war camps, planning to halt for the night due to the incoming high storm. Tin then updates Shallan that Szeth has killed the Vedin king and 6 other high princes, and they expect more news via Spanreed later. Now returning to Bridge 4, Teft has finally completed the task of finding 40 men, the best he could find, who could be trained as leaders for the 20 squads of former bridgemen. But now it seems like Teft has disappeared, and we'll figure out where he went later on. Now as they sit for stew, Rock has to chase away an Ardent with a sketchbook who wanted to draw the bridgemen. Now another hidden detail, this Ardent has been confirmed to be Naz. Now, I'm really curious to know why Chris wants these sketches of the Bridge 4 tattoos, and why it's important to her. Tell me all of your theories in the comments. Now, in Chapter 32, Kaladin dreams of being the Storm during a high storm, speaking with the Stormfather, who warns him that he will betray and kill Syl. A second, larger storm with red lightning appears coming from the opposite direction, and the Stormfather tells Kaladin he comes. Kaladin awakes and Syl says something equally ominous. Syl spun around, twisting this way, then that. Her small eyes opened wide. He's coming. Who? The storm? The one who hates, she whispered. The darkness inside. Kaladin, he's watching. Something's going to happen. Something bad. Preparing for danger, Kaladin urges Dalinar to evacuate the king and head to the war camp. As they flee, they encounter a dark hallway with spheres drained of light and a hole cut into the wall. The assassin in white appears, leaking stormlight. Dalinar orders Renarin to flee with the king, while he, Adolin, and Kaladin fight Szeth. Szeth binds Adolin to the ceiling and shatters Kaladin and Dalinar's spears, though Kaladin manages to injure him. At one point, Dalinar catches the Honor Blade in mid-air, a move called the Last Clap. Wait a minute, in the Way of Kings, he caught a Chasmfiend claw, and now he catches an Honor Blade barehanded. Is there anything the Blackthorn can't catch? Anyway, Szeth slices his blade right through Kaladin's arm, leaving it dead and lifeless, and kicks him aside. Syl urges Kaladin to get up, warning that Szeth is something worse than a Radiant. Dalinar tells Szeth that he can't have the king, and Szeth says he's not here for the king. I'm here for you. And right before he can kill Dalinar, Kaladin tackles him, sending both of them through the hole in the wall. As they fall, Kaladin draws Stormlight from Szeth's gemstones, and he lands hard, but the Stormlight heals him. Szeth is shocked by Kaladin's survival, assuming he accidentally lashed him. Kaladin then heals his arm, light streaming from his hand, and this truly surprises Szeth, who questions what Kaladin is. Kaladin replies that he is a Windrunner like Szeth, but Szeth angrily denies it, declaring himself truthless. The assassin scrambled backward, eyes as wide as if Kaladin had turned into a Chasmfiend.
They told me I was a liar! They told me I was wrong! Szeth, Son Valano, truthless! They named me truthless!
He questions if they're all back, and Kaladin doesn't know exactly what he's talking about, but says yes anyway. Now, to briefly recap, Szeth had originally claimed the Radiants were returning, but was called a liar and was named Truthless for his heresy. He's now spent the past 7 years living a nightmare punishment for his false claim. And now he finds out this claim was true, and those who called him truthless were false, and all the havoc he's wreaked was completely unjustified. Szeth then flees, and Kaladin collapses in exhaustion. Later, when he awakes and heads back to the palace, Dalinar and the others are relieved to see him alive. Kaladin lies about how he survived the fall, attributing it to Szeth's abilities. Now, Elhokar mistakenly believes that Szeth was after him, and no one corrects him. Now, Adolin is suspicious of Kaladin's miraculous recovery, and this marks the turning point of his paranoia about Surgebinders. He doesn't understand how Kaladin came way closer to fending off Szeth than should be possible for any non-Shardbearer. And Kaladin is so tempted to reveal to all of them that he's a Surgebinder, but he admits to himself that he's too much of a coward. Elhokar finds glyphs carved into the wood, and Renarin reveals that they predict the end of all nations in 38 days. Kaladin finds Beld's corpse and mourns his failure, but Syl reassures him that Beld chose to protect. Kaladin then questions how Szeth can kill without honor, comparing it to his own actions. Now at this point, they don't know Szeth's blade is an honor blade, but Syl explains that Szeth's shard blade is different and that Kaladin's actions are protective. He finds Haber alive but severely injured and brings him back for medical care, telling him he can remain with Bridge 4 as a cook with Rock. Shallan reads a span-read with Tin, learning about the political unrest in Ya Kaved and worrying about the consequences of her family if a succession war breaks out. Now Tin thinks they should go there after finishing up in the Shattered Plains in order to exploit the chaos. And the span-read goes on to mention deserters with bounties placed on them by Sadeas. Now Shallan is angered when Tin expresses a desire to turn them in, reminding Tin that she promised them amnesty. Tin dismisses this, saying a con artist can't believe their own lies, and Sadeas will never forgive the deserters. As the span-read continues, Tin gleefully announces the news of Yasna's death and the loss of the Wind's pleasure. This confirms Tin's last job was to kill Yasna. Now there's a tense moment when Tin realizes that Shallan had been Yasna's ward. She immediately attacks her, demanding to know if Yasna survived. Shallan denies it, but Tin tries to kill her, and using Stormlight, Shallan creates an illusion to distract Tin long enough to summon her shard blade and kill her. Thanks to Pattern, Vatha, Gaz, and the deserters arrive, saying they heard a voice urging them to help her. They managed to fight off Tin's men and reached her just in time. Seeing the shard blade, Vatha remarks that Shallan could have handled the bandits alone. Shallan explains the voice was her spren, Tin was an assassin, and orders them to search her tent for documents. The span-read reveals that Tin's employers, the Ghostbloods, want to meet with her in the war camps. And realizing the Ghostbloods are also investigating Urithiru, Shallan replies to arrange the meeting. Interlude 5. As a high storm approaches Narak, Thud informs Eshonai that they have a meeting with the Alethi in 7 days, though neither Dalinar nor the Surgebinder were present when it was arranged. Eshonai brings her captive Spren into the storm to transform, facing the Stormfather head-on without shelter. The storm tears her shield away, leaving her clinging to rocks. The Stormfather asks if she truly wants this, but before she can respond, the red Spren breaks free, hitting her in the chest with red lightning. The Stormfather apologizes, saying her transformation was inevitable, and Eshonai begins to change. Interlude 6. The Swordmaster Xyle wakes up as his life sense alerts him to Kaladin's approach. He opens the door just as Kaladin's about to knock, and Kaladin looks exhausted and explains that he just stopped an assassination attempt on the king, and he asks if Xyle will still train him, but Xyle refuses, telling him to return at a better time when he's in a better mood. Xyle then goes back to sleep, reminiscing about the voice that he used to hear in his head years ago. Now, getting the point of view of Xyle is really interesting here. First of all, he knows that Kaladin has a Spren, and we also learn that he has this life sense. Now, again, Xyle is using some odd metaphors that are color-based and don't really seem to make sense to Rosharians. And this is where I'm gonna mention a pretty big Cosmere Easter egg, so if you haven't read Warbreaker yet, then you may want to skip ahead to the next interlude. Now, we've been getting these hints that Xyle is different, and while he may be a side character in Stormlight, he's a major character in Warbreaker. Xyle is none other than Vasher from the planet Nelthus, and the voice he expects to hear in his mind is the sentient sword Nightblood, which he now doesn't have for some reason. I wonder where it went. Comment below if you picked up on the hints that Xyle was Vasher, and also comment if you want to see a Warbreaker sequel. In Interlude 7, we finally get some answers to what happened at the very end of the Way of Kings, when a madman showed up claiming to be one of the heralds. In this interlude, a man named Borden reports to the king and Dalinar about transporting that madman to the Shattered Plains, along with the odd company of Wit. Now, he reports that midway through the trip, Wit jumped down from the wagon, hit himself in the head with a rock several times, and then said, "I needed an objective frame of reference by which to judge the experience of your company. Somewhere between 4 and 5 blows, I place it," before running off into the hills. Now, the madman keeps mumbling about death and fire and screaming, and he claims to be Telenel Elin, the Herald of War, the one who held his oath pact for 4,500 years. Now, this man speaks about the desolations and the heralds preparing to help the world for the time of the return. And Borden mentions that the man just dropped his shardblade without it vanishing, and he's always had dark eyes. Dalinar says he has a use for this mysterious blade, and the madman, thinking he's late, wonders how much time has passed and says that he needs to be brought to their leaders. And then Interlude 8. After the high storm, Eshonai returns to Narok, energized by her transformation, and she notices red lightning flickering around her and feels lighter and more powerful than in war form. Now, Thud confronts her about her red eyes, a sign mentioned in their songs, but Eshonai dismisses him. Eshonai explains to Venli that she can now move freely during the high storms and feels a storm that they can guide and use against their enemies. Eshonai then addresses the crowd, telling them of the Storm Father's betrayal and his intent to help the humans, while rallying them to fight the humans with their new form. As the crowd praises her, she ignores a voice inside her that screams in horror. Now, I should mention that all throughout part 2, we've been getting these epigraphs, and these are stanzas from the songs containing the oral history of the listeners. And there's a lot of details in these epigraphs, so feel free to pause and read each set individually. Now, the songs of listing recount many of the common forms that listeners were once able to take. The songs of secrets discusses the listener gods, their forms, and the unmade. The Song of Winds mentions the danger of storm form and stormspren, and foreshadows the event at the Battle of Narok. The Song of Histories is the way in which the listeners were able to keep their history and pass it on to younger generations. And the Song of Wars presumably details the history of various listener wars. The song states that the Shattered Plains were not created by the listener gods, the Fused. It also indicates that written records with more information about the Shattering once existed, but they've since been lost. The Song of Revision discusses art form and mentions a desire to attract creation spren. And then the Song of Spren discusses spren and surges and the relationship between those and the listeners. Now moving on to part 3, Deadly. This covers chapters 35 to 58 and interludes 9 to 11. Adolin, exhausted from guarding his father all night after the assassination attempt, practices throwing his shard blade, but struggles to focus. Having been caught without shard blade once, he now decides to never take it off. He's becoming paranoid and manic, and he hasn't been sleeping. And he's also deeply suspicious of Kaladin, but acknowledges his skill in protecting Dalinar. Returning to the war camp, Adolin sees a rare procession of soulcasters and talks to Kadash, Kadash, an ardent soulcaster. Adolin watches the soulcasters create a stone windbreak, and then he questions Kadash about the ancient Radiance, especially since the assassin had Radiant-like abilities. Kadash agrees to help him in his research. Adolin's surprised when one of the soulcasters doesn't appear to be completely human anymore. The woman's skin had hardened to something like stone, smooth with fine cracks, as if she was a living statue. Now, soulcasters who use fabrials to do what Radiance can do through their Nahil bonds clearly pay a very high price. And a fun hidden detail is that we briefly see the elderly ardent couple who were examining flamespren and weird culinary stuff back in one of the interludes from The Way of Kings. Now, Navani is overseeing a successful experiment using fabrials to lift a platform in the air, and Adolin realizes its military potential. He then confronts her about her relationship with Dalinar and the awkwardness that it creates, but Navani dismisses the concern. She also tells Adolin that he's temporarily free of his betrothal due to Yasna's disappearance. And then we move back to Shallan. Now, Vatha has seemed to have a change of heart since she killed Tin, and he reports that he burned and buried the bodies of Tin and her guards. Now, entering the war camp, Shallan is worried about her betrothal, and as her palanquin makes its way to the palace, she sketches herself confidently confronting Dalinar. When she arrives, Kaladin spots her and questions her identity, believing Adolin's real fiancé was lost at sea, and Shallan provides a span-read printout for Navani to verify her claim. But she and Kaladin get into a bit of an argument. Though frustrated, Shallan hopes the commotion will get her the audience with Dalinar that she needs. Gaz warns her that Kaladin was once a slave and that he's dangerous. Eventually, she does get confirmed to go meet Dalinar. Meanwhile, Adolin paces, tired from guarding his father, while pondering the lack of a unified strategy to deal with Szeth. He taunts Relis into a duel, but Relis refuses. Alit, however, accepts Adolin's challenge. Sadeas appears and successfully taunts Adolin into nearly attacking him. I mean, Adolin wanted to sink a dagger in him and twist to give him a nice slow death, which obviously he deserves. But before Adolin throws a punch, Amaram restrains him, advising Adolin to ignore Sadeas. Now, Amaram insists that he's needed to bridge the gap between Sadeas and Dalinar, though Adolin disagrees. He then gets distracted and spots Shallan, and he's immediately drawn to her, realizing who she is. Now, Shallan offers her condolences to Dalinar and Navani for Yasna's loss. She explains she has some of Yasna's belongings and knowledge of her research, which Navani doubts. Shallan then provides an account of the attack on the Wind's Pleasure, with the alteration of having set the ship on fire instead of soulcasting it to water, and although Navani criticizes her actions, blaming her for Yasna's death, Dalinar supports her. She briefly describes her journey with deserters who saved her, and Dalinar promises royal pardons for them. The conversation then shifts to Shallan's betrothal to Adolin, and after some nervous flirting between the two, Dalinar speaks privately with Shallan, agreeing to let their betrothal stand for now. However, their discussion is interrupted by High Prince Sabarial. Now, Shallan observes the political dynamics of the meeting, noting the different factions at play, and in order to avoid being used by the High Princes, she lies about working for Sabarial, who plays along. Now, clearly, Sabarial is a bit of an outcast among the High Princes and their politics, and afterward, Dalinar announces a change in strategy, proposing peace with the Parshendi or a full assault. And he outlines plans to scout the plains, train new shardbearers, and questions whether the Parshendi still control Szeth. At the end of the meeting, she secures a royal pardon for Vatha and the deserters, and they're very surprised to see they now have a place to stay. And then afterwards, Shallan and Sabarial return to his war camp, and Sabarial explains that he profits from manufacturing and farming and selling goods to the other high princes, which offsets all the fines he gets for skipping the plateau runs. Kelowna, Sabarial's mistress, helps Shallan settle in, and it's very clear that Sabarial and Kelowna are actually a perfect match, and they truly care for each other. We then get another flashback 4 years ago. Shallan's father is hosting a feast, pretending the family isn't impoverished, and the guests, Bright Lord Tavenar and his family, seem uninterested. Now, during the meal, Shallan's father announces his upcoming marriage to Melise Gevelmar, but the subdued response angers him. He gives out some gifts for his children, fine daggers for the boys, and a silver necklace for Shallan. Now, they'd also received a brief letter from Helleran 6 months back, along with a book by the famous Jasnah Kholin for Shallan. So basically, Helleran set her on the path for her education. Now, the feast is interrupted by Redin, the bastard son of High Prince Valam, who has come to investigate Shallan's mother's death. Redin invites any of the children to testify against their father, but fear silences them. After he leaves, Shallan's father collapses into his chair, defeated. In the next chapter, 37 days remain before the glyph countdown ends. Kaladin is trying to train as many bridgemen as possible, and Syl questions his motive. He admits he wants to defeat Szeth in order to protect Dalinar. Now, he then tries experimenting with his new powers, and he tries walking on walls like Szeth did, but fails. He then looks at the stormlight rising from his skin, and for a moment he thinks he sees shadows of another realm where the sun looks different. And this glimpse of Shadesmar seems to prompt a shift in his thinking, where he imagines the chasm wall to be the floor relative to himself, and this causes him to fall towards the wall. And when he gets up, he's standing on the wall. Everyone's excited, and Kaladin then runs up the chasm wall, realizing that his powers are tied to his desire to protect. At the very top, he tells Syl that he wants to know that he can trust Dalinar, because then he can reveal his powers. He also vows to kill Amaram, which doesn't make Syl too happy. Then later, back at the barracks, Renarin asks to join Bridge 4, wanting to prove himself as a warrior. Despite the doubts from Moash, Kaladin allows Renarin to join as a recruit. Now, Kaladin suspects that Moash might have helped in the attempt on Elokar's life, but he keeps it to himself. Moash then suggests that Kaladin challenge Amaram to a duel for justice. Meanwhile, Shallan wakes up in her new quarters and checks the span read, and she reads Tin's old correspondence about Jasnah, House Davar, and the Ghostbloods. Now, Pattern detects that there's a hidden code within the messages. Shallan worries about infiltrating the Ghostbloods, but uses her sketching and light-weaving abilities to create an illusionary disguise. She creates a face that's a little older, is dark-eyed, and has a scar on the chin. Now, when the Ghostbloods request a meeting with Tin that evening, Shallan replies that Tin is unwell and will send an apprentice in her place. The Ghostbloods agree, providing a map and time for the meeting, and with her new disguise, she follows the map with Pattern ensuring that she's not being followed. She arrives at the building, is admitted by a Horneater guard, and descends into a strange trophy-filled room, and there she meets several people, including a rat-toothed man, a creepy woman with a carapace mask named Eotil, and a man named Maraise, who appears to be the leader. Now, she handles herself with a combination of Jasnah's self-confidence and Tin's boldness. Maraise questions Tin's absence, but Shallan, going under the name Vale, claims that Tin prefers to work through intermediaries. Maraise is intrigued by Shallan's boldness and reveals the next target, Amaram, and Shallan, or Vale, accepts the mission. Now, there are a lot of Cosmere Easter eggs in this chapter, connecting the Ghostbloods to much wider Cosmere significance. I'm gonna cover all of them right now, so minor spoiler warning for a lot of books in the Cosmere. It's not going to be any major plot spoilers, but if you want to skip ahead, feel free to do so. So first of all, there's a lot of weird trophies in this room, like enormous gem hearts, a tusk likely from a Whitespine, an eye socket possibly from a Xanthid. There's also a vial of pale sand. Now, this is invested sand from the planet Taldane, the planet from White Sand. and the same planet that Chris comes from. Now, this sand actually turns white in the presence of certain kinetic usage of investiture, so it's likely being used as an alarm to tell who's using investiture. Shallan notes seeing some thick hairpins, and these are likely actually hemalurgic spikes from Scadrial, which is kind of gross. There's also a rare flower from Nalthis, and this is highly efficient for awakening, as well as a lock of golden hair, which is likely the royal locks also from Nalthis. There's a silver knife from Threnody, and a white tree branch with writing on it, which Brandon Sanderson has confirmed is from Yolen. Now, Yolen is the homeworld of Hoid, and it's only been mentioned indirectly in the Cosmere so far, but it's from the unpublished Dragonsteel novel. Now, there's also some delicate pale pink crystals, and Sanderson has actually confirmed that Mraize has some bits of Aether in his collection, so I'm assuming these crystals are Aether. And Aether is from a yet unpublished novel called Aether of Night. Okay, now we need to talk about Eatil. Eatil is described as being short and tan and having a red-orange mask that looks like the skin had started to grow around the edges of the mask. Now, Eatil is a world hopper, and she's originally from Silverlight, but she also has some southern Scadrian ancestry. Now, Eatil appears to be one of the highest ranking members of the Ghostbloods on Roshar, and she actually serves as a teacher and mentor for Mraize. He even refers to her as his Bapsk. Oh, and Mraize's green chicken is actually an aviar, the same type of bird from Sixth of the Dusk. That's all the Cosmere Easter eggs I could find. Anyway, after leaving, Pattern warns that the masked woman is tailing her. Shallan uses a sketch to create an illusionary wall to escape, but her disguise fades as her stormlight runs out. She returns to the manor and begins planning how to investigate Amaram and interact with Adolin. In the next chapter, Kaladin arrives at the Light Eyes training grounds with Moash, Teft, and Yake in order to train under Xyle, who allows the bridgemen to practice with a shard blade to prepare for Szeth's potential attack. However, Kaladin refuses to use the blade himself because he knows it would offend Syl, and he uses the valid excuse that he's had too many friends die by shard blades. So instead, he faces Xyle unarmed, practicing his dodging strikes. Now, Adolin arrives, acknowledging Kaladin with a nod of respect. Kaladin asks Xyle if he can teach him how to do the last clap that he saw Dalinar perform, but Xyle dismisses it as unnecessary. And after training, Kaladin notices Shallan nearby, and as he and Adolin approach her, Adolin explains how she's likely there to admire him spar like all the women do, but then Shallan surprises them by walking right past and asking an ardent permission to sketch shardplate and shard blades, completely ignoring Adolin's ego. Now, Kaladin goes to Moash and discusses Elokar's attempted assassination, and Moash hints at being involved, but he asks Kaladin to meet with the others to learn more. And although wary, Kaladin agrees because he wants to uncover the truth. Flashback 3.5 years ago, at the Middlefest Fair, Shallan gets to explore unchaperoned, and here she sees a chicken that's been trained to talk. Now, if you haven't noticed yet, Rosharans use the term chicken for every bird-like animal on Roshar because of how rare they are, so keep an eye out for chickens. Not every chicken is really a chicken. This one is probably a parakeet. She delivers a note to her brother Balat, who's at the Axehound fights and seems to have a weird fixation on watching animals kill each other, but she helps him set up this secretive meeting. Then she goes back to her father, who's in a meeting with a man she doesn't recognize, a man dressed all in black. And this man seems startled when he sees Shallan and almost drops his glass. He claims to have brought word from her brother Helleran. However, her father demands they don't speak Helleran's name. Now, I should note that this man dressed in black is Wit, and it's mentioned that Wit dumps a pouch of powder into his own cup and drinks it. And according to Brandon Sanderson, Wit, or Hoid, uses allomantic metals, probably zinc or brass. Maybe he was using brass to dampen the emotions of her father. Now, Shallan seeks out her brother Wickham, who tells her that she can't fix their broken family, and that he won't be around to see their collapse because he'll be dead by then. Now, feeling like a fool, she gives him a gift that she brought with her, a set of math problems, then runs away. Trying to compose herself, the messenger in black, Wit, approaches, and he tells her the message sent by Halloran to her father is that he has eyes nearby and is watching. Wit then asks her if Spren talked to her, which causes Shallan to think about twisted symbols the eye should not see, and her mother's soul in a box. She tells him that of course Spren don't talk, then Wit tells Shallan that Halloran was right, her father is destroying their family, but he's wrong about everything else. Two blind men waited at the end of an era, contemplating beauty. They sat atop the world's highest cliff, overlooking the land and seeing nothing. Can beauty be taken from a man? He then asks her to say the most beautiful thing that she can imagine, and she describes a scene with her family happily living together. And as she talks, Wit pulls on some spheres and wisps of stormlight hang in the air between them. This startles her and the light fades, but Wit tells her that she will need to understand the nature of lies and see truth before she can expand upon it. Back at Bridge 4, Hobber is serving dinner as Rock proudly watches, while Renarin is quietly washing the dishes. Apparently the rest have accepted his presence. Now Cal seeks out Shen, the Parshman member of Bridge 4, and hands him a spear, giving him permission to train. Shen calls him a good man and appears to want to say more, but unfortunately he's interrupted by Moash, who wants to take Kaladin out for some fun. At the tavern, Rock shares a story about his homeland and the Horneater's connection to their gods through their hot springs. They're able to view the place of the gods through these hot springs, and Rock tells the fellas that he saw the god of travel and mischief emerge from one of these pools in the Horneater Peaks. A god he says is named Lunu Anaki, and this god cannot hurt people, and he appeared as a young man with an angular face and white hair. This description startles Sigil. Now, if you haven't clued in, this is another Cosmere Easter egg. This pool, and maybe others in the area, is what is known as a perpendicularity. It can be used to travel to other perpendicularities on other planets in the Cosmere. And the god that Rock saw was none other than Hoid, or Wit. And Hoid's inability to harm others comes from his involvement in the shattering of Adonalsium. Now after this, Moash pulls Kaladin aside to introduce him to a group planning Elokar's assassination. Graves, their leader, argues that Elokar is unfit to be king and suggests Dalinar as his replacement. And though Kaladin disapproves of their plan, he says he'll think about it. But later he tells Moash he wants no part in their scheme and warns him to stop meeting with them. Meanwhile, Shallan and Pattern are studying maps of Roshar, noting the contradictions about the location of Urathiru, and it's said there are no roads to Urathiru, which makes Shallan wonder how one gets there. She finds an annotation written by Yasna speaking of folktales and stories that all talk about instantaneous travel and the Oath Gates. Now, Pattern reads the maps, and because of his talent with finding patterns, ends up partially deciphering the Dawn-chant language that's mystified scholars for ages. Then we get a flashback 3 years ago. Shallan, Balat, and Wickham relaxing in the gardens when a carriage arrives. Wickham tells Shallan that her help has kept their family going, and gives her Blackbane he'd been carrying for a year, symbolizing he no longer plans to off himself. Moments later, there's a commotion in the house, and Shallan finds 3 men demanding payment for Jushu's gambling debts. Lin refuses to pay, handing Jushu over to them. When Lin confines her to her room, she grabs the daggers her brother received as gifts and rushes after Jushu. Name for me one reason I should show this man pity. In my house, he was an arrogant glutton, acting without thought for the difficulty he would cause you, his family. Our mother was murdered, Shallan said. That night, as I cried, Jushu held me. It was all she had. She convinces the men to accept the daggers and her necklace as partial payment, and then returning home, she hears shouts and eventually faces her father, who has brutally punished their serving maid. Lyn ominously tells Shallan that he's found a way to control his anger by punishing others, and warns her not to defy him again. Back to the present, Shallan meets Adolin for their first date at an open-air winehouse, and it's pretty evident she really has the hots for him. She's very distracted by romantic thoughts. Now, Adolin explains how at this winehouse, they're supposed to sit and drink and watch as the high storm approaches. She asks about his experience with plateau runs and Chasmfiends, then she lets her curiosity get the better of her when it comes to shardplate and bodily functions, and Adolin, being his honest self, admits to having shat himself 3 times in his shardplate, all on purpose. And it's here, after laughing together, having this genuine moment, that icebreaker then opens up to more serious discussions, and Adolin fully opens up to Shallan and tells her about Dalinar's visions, the betrayal of Sadeas, their salvation by the bridge crew, and his current quest to win as many shard blades as possible through dueling. Shallan then confides in him about Yasna's research on the Voidbringers and the connection to Parshmen, and when the storm arrives, Shallan becomes entranced, wanting to sketch it, but Adolin pulls her away to safety just before it hits. Upon returning to Dalinar's complex, Adolin discovers strange glyphs etched into the wall that say 32 days, seek the center. Now later on, the group meets up to plan for the upcoming meeting with the Parshendi, and Adolin decides to attend the meeting in Dalinar's place to protect his father. Riding Dalinar's horse, Gallant, Adolin meets Eshonai on a plateau. However, Eshonai's demeanor has changed, and she declares there will only be peace when one side is destroyed. King Gavilar, Eshonai said, as if mulling over the name. He should not have revealed his plans to us that night. Poor fool. He did not know. He bragged, thinking we would welcome the return of our gods. She explains that Gavilar was killed to stop his plan to return the Parshendi gods, and after this tense meeting, Adolin returns to the war camps, feeling that he should have let Dalinar attend. Dalinar says they can now fight with a clear conscience, and he reveals his plan to end the war by leading a large force to the center of the Shattered Plains during the Weeping, urging Adolin to win more duels and rally support for the expedition from the neutral High Princes. Now, Chapter 52 alternates between short clips of Kaladin and Shallan on their different missions, each honing their Radiance skills. Kaladin walks through the Shattered Plains at night, heading to a plateau where he met Wit weeks before. Ensuring that no one sees him, he jumps into a chasm and begins practicing lashing, trying to improve his abilities to prepare for facing Szeth. Sprinting across walls and jumping chasms, eventually his instincts are refined and lashings become more natural. He hovers in place over the plateaus, and from above he notices a pattern to them. He asks Syl if she's been with him since he was a child, and she says yes and no. The winds knew him and they led her to him. Syl then explains how Szeth's blade is special. It's designed to grant abilities that's similar to their bond. And Cal says he can't fight Szeth without a shard blade, but he's been avoiding training with the blade that Xyle offers. He asks her if a new blade can be forged, one that doesn't bear the stain of broken promises, and Syl says yes, but then goes silent when he asks how. Now, with hundreds of Windspren flying around him as ribbons of light, Kaladin feels a surge of joy at truly becoming a Windrunner, a sense that everything is going to go right. But then, as his feet return to the earth, this joy descends into anger and bitterness towards Amaram, and he contemplates killing him. And he's also trying to decide if he should report Moash and his new Patriot friends. Back at the barracks, Shen informs Kaladin that he must leave immediately. Kaladin calls him a free man and permits it, and Shen reveals that his true name is Ralain, and he calls Kaladin a good man. Now, meanwhile, Shallan, disguised as a messenger boy, infiltrates Sadeas' war camp and enters Amaram's manor. She changes her disguise to mimic the maid and navigates inside, and it's clear she's been practicing and getting skilled at light weaving. Almost bumping into Amaram, Shallan diverts him by claiming a messenger is waiting. Then she gets Pattern to pick the lock to his room, which is filled with maps and storm predictions. She discovers that Amaram is seeking the center of the Shattered Plains and is attempting to learn from the Parshendi how to return the Voidbringers. She realizes both he and Yasna, as well as the Ghostbloods, were all investigating the same things. Using Pattern to impersonate Amaram's voice, Shallan tells the kitchen staff to cover for the maid and ensures her infiltration goes unnoticed. She then changes back to the messenger boy and tells Amaram a message from Shallan Devar that she would like permission to sketch his shard blade. When Amaram summons his blade, Shallan recognizes it as her brother Helleran's. She asks where he got it, and he lies and says he got it from a young Vedin man who tried to assassinate him. Now, Shallan concludes that he killed Helleran. She leaves the manor, struggling with the weight of the revelation. Moving back to Adolin, who's facing off in the arena against Alit. Using a new technique, with precision, he strikes dozens of cracks into the man's armor until it completely seizes up for lack of stormlight. While Adolin is pronounced the victor, the crowd is very annoyed. Now, after the duel, Shallan congratulates him, but Relis Ruthar barges in with a foul temper, but Adolin goads him into a duel by offering all of his family's shards against those of Relis and whoever he brings with him. And later, Shallan, disguised as Vale, meets with the Ghostbloods in the Unclaimed Hills. It occurred to her that this person she became when she put on the hat and dark hair was not an imitation of someone else, not a different person. It was just a version of Shallan herself. Shallan surprises Mraize by proving she succeeded with detailed sketches of Amaram's maps. She inadvertently reveals her talent for sketching and is forced to demonstrate. Now, Mraize realizes that Shallan has killed Tin and is working on her own, and he commends her for it. Mraize offers her another mission, but warns her that the Ghostbloods protect their own. Now, as she leaves, Shallan realizes he basically gave the others permission to try to kill her. She creates an illusion of a boulder and hides within it, while sending Pattern to use her voice to tell the carriage driver to return to the camp. She overhears Mraize instructing someone to send her sketches to someone he refers to as Master Thadakar. Mraize mentions they are close, but so is Rastaris and his cronies. Now, he also calls Taravangian an old fool, and mentions a creature in Tukar that he's not convinced is human. Now, here, this is kind of a hidden detail, so let me explain. Here he's referring to Tezim, this warlord and god priest of the Tukari people, who claims to be an aspect of the Almighty. But if Tezim isn't human, then what exactly is he? Well, that's a Rapho. On her way back to camp, Shallan finds her burned carriage with the driver and his parshmen murdered. The Ghostbloods do not mess around. Later on, Kaladin, worrying about the possibility of Shallan being an assassin, acts as a guard and escort for Adolin on his date with Shallan. Now, they're all surprised to find that Wit is their carriage driver, and Wit shames Kaladin for abandoning the flute that he gave him, hinting that the origins of the flute would blow his mind. Clearly, this is more than an ordinary flute. And he also hints that he knows Kaladin is a surge binder, and Kaladin doesn't know how to react to this. They do some verbal sparring, with Kaladin saying that music is for women, and Hoyd responds, "All people are musicians. The question is whether or not they share their songs." When they pick up Shallan, she's also surprised to see Wit and actually walks up and gives him a hug. And this is one of the only times we see Wit flabbergasted. She recognizes him from years ago. Now, Adolin tells him to go after women his own age, and Wit mentions, very mysteriously, that might be difficult because there's only one of those around these parts, and she and I never did get along. Now, this is kind of a light Easter egg. The only woman Hoyd's age would have to be the shard holder of cultivation, and for some reason, they don't get along. Now, during the ride, Shallan suggests that Adolin could invoke the King's Boon to challenge Sadeas if he wins his upcoming duel. Kaladin realizes this could also be a way to deal with Amaram. They arrive at the menagerie, where Shallan sketches animals, and there's a colorful chicken that reminds her of one that she saw years ago. There's There's sky eels, a chawl-like creature, and most notably a Whitespine, a large predatory creature known to attack humans. Basically, this is Roshar's Velociraptor. Amaram and Dalinar show up, with Dalinar announcing the refounding of the Knights Radiant and naming Amaram as their leader, leaving Kaladin in disbelief. Moving on to chapter 56, Whitespine Uncaged. Kaladin and Sigzil arrive at the dueling arena where the entire Kholin household is present. Kaladin is furious about Amaram's new position, and he decides to act himself if Dalinar won't, but he ignores Sigzil's suggestion to reveal his own powers. Moash admits to meeting with Graves and the Patriots again, directly breaking Kaladin's orders. Meanwhile, Adolin prepares for his duel, burning a glyph ward that Shallan painted for him and talking to his blade. Now, he enters the arena expecting 2 opponents, but is shocked when 4, Relis, Alit, Abrobadar, and Yakimov appear. Navani believes they're going to try and cripple him. Sadeas reveals that he exploited Adolin's vague challenge terms, and Dalinar tries to stop the fight, but is overruled by the High Judge. Before the fight begins, Xyle points out the fear spren around the men to Adolin, and says, "They're scared of you. Show them why." Adolin attacked. He leapt forward, sweeping with a barrage of strikes at Relis. Alit jumped away with a curse as he did so. They were like men with spears prodding at a Whitespine, and this Whitespine was not yet caged. Adolin manages to hold his own for a time until they all surround him, and Renarin, despite having no shard plate, rushes in to help his brother. Adolin struggles against the 4 opponents and realizes they're willing to seriously injure or kill him and Renarin. Dalinar, pleading for assistance, meets eyes with Amaram, but Amaram looks away. He asks, "Where is our honor?" And from beside him, he hears a whispered voice. "Honor is dead, but I'll see what I can do. If this goes poorly, take care of my men." With spear in hand, Kaladin jumps into the arena. He sped up, then lunged between 2 of the shard-bearers, ramming his spear into Relis's cracked vambrace. The man let out a shout of pain, and Kaladin pulled his spear back, twisting between the attackers and getting close to Adolin. The young man in blue armor glanced at him, then quickly turned to put his back toward Kaladin. Kaladin put his own back toward Adolin. "What are you doing here, bridge boy?" Adolin hissed from within his helmet, "Playing one of the 10 fools. Welcome to the party." Working together, Kaladin distracts one opponent while Adolin focuses on the others, while Shallan sends Pattern to distract one of the duelists, who begins wildly swinging at the sand. Kaladin's surge binding allows him to kick Relis and crack his armor, though it drains his stormlight, and as the fight intensifies, Kaladin uses a broken spear to force Alit to yield. With Renarin sitting injured in the sand, the remaining opponents focus on Adolin, but Kaladin helps by using a helmet as a makeshift shield to block their shard blades. Wind, motion. Kaladin fought 2 shard bearers at once, knocking their blades aside with the helm. He couldn't attack, didn't dare try to attack. He could only survive, and in this, the winds seemed to urge him. Instinct, then something deeper, guided his steps. He danced between those blades, cool air wrapping around him, and for a moment, he felt, impossibly, that he could have dodged just as well if his eyes had been closed. The shard bearers cursed, trying again and again. Kaladin heard the judge say something, but was too absorbed in the fight to pay attention. The crowd was growing louder. He leaped one attack, then stepped just to the side of another. You could not kill the wind. You could not stop it. It was beyond the touch of men. It was infinite. Relis charges at Renarin, but Kaladin performs the last clap maneuver that he saw Dalinar perform earlier, catching Relis's blade. Both Kaladin and Relis hear a scream, and Relis drops his shard blade and flees, forfeiting the duel. With Yakimov also yielding, Adolin wins. Elokar praises Adolin and offers him a boon. As Sadeas tries to leave, Adolin demands the right to duel him. Kaladin, seizing the moment, but accidentally ruining the moment, he accuses Amaram of murder, demanding justice. The crowd falls silent as Elhokar orders Kaladin's arrest. Later on, Kaladin, in chains, listens as Dalinar argues on his behalf, while Elhokar berates him for accusing Amaram and ruining their immediate chance to challenge Sadeas. Elhokar threatens to execute Kaladin for slander, but Dalinar refuses to allow it. Instead, Elhokar orders Kaladin to be imprisoned indefinitely. Dalinar thanks Kaladin for saving his sons, but reprimands him for ruining their strategy and accusing Amaram without sufficient evidence. He tells Kaladin that 17 witnesses have testified in Amaram's favor. Kaladin is taken to a prison cell where he tells Sulfrena that he will never trust Light Eyes again. Meanwhile, Sadeas, back in his quarters, reflects on his narrow escape and orders Ela to gather incriminating evidence against Dalinar and arranges for his assassination. And then we get to Interlude 9. Lift and a group of thieves sneak into the Bronze Palace during the selection of a new Prime Aquasix. Now, Lift has a spren named Windle, but she just calls him Voidbringer, much to his dismay. Now, she's wary of a man she calls Darkness, who she fears is still hunting her. And this man is Nail. As they infiltrate the palace, Lift disobeys the plan to steal clothes and decides to search for food instead. Gox decides to follow along with her. Now, Lift sneaks into the dining area, overhearing the viziers discuss the Prime's selection. However, she's spotted by Nail and arrested. She tries to escape, but is drained of her Stormlight by a Larkin. After managing to eat some food, she refuels her powers and evades the capture by using her radiant abilities to make herself frictionless. But unfortunately, the teen boy Gox is killed, and determined to help him, Lift uses her power of regrowth in order to heal him. Now, Nail captures her again and reveals that she's an edge dancer, admitting that he's hunting proto-radiants like herself because their abilities could bring back the Desolations. Before he can execute her, Gox, miraculously alive, is named the new Prime Aquasix and pardons Lift, forcing Nail to release her. In Interlude 10, we find Szeth sitting atop Urathiru, tormented by the screams of those he has killed. He reflects on how his banishment and actions over the past 8 years have been based on a lie. Seeking answers or a new purpose, he leaves the ancient tower. Interlude 11 brings us back to Eshonai, who's now in storm form. Now, she struggles with this inner voice warning her of danger, and she also has access to new rhythms now. And some of these rhythms, she can almost hear voices speaking to her, advising her. These new rhythms make the other listeners nervous. Now, she questions Venli, who admits that she knew exactly what this form would do to her before ever taking it on herself. She then meets with the ruling council, urging them to transform more Parshendi to prepare for the Alethi attack. She demonstrates her new power by summoning a mini storm. Eshonai rallies her soldiers to take storm form and orders the transformation of all civilians, and segregates those who refuse, including her own mother. She believes her friends that have too much fear of the old gods and don't trust her because of her red eyes will have to be executed. Now, the dissenters end up escaping into the chasms, but Eshonai believes they won't survive the next high storm anyway. Her sister confronts her, but she threatens to kill Venli, but doesn't because she needs her for the storm spread. The old Eshonai continues to scream inside her head, and it's very clear that something else, some other entity, now controls this new Eshonai. Now, the epigraphs for part 3 of Words of Radiance. These are all quotes from the in-universe book of the same name. Again, I'm not going to be diving into the epigraphs fully in this video, since it would just make the video even longer than it is, but there is a lot of info about the different orders of the Knights Radiant. Now moving on to part 4, The Approach, covering chapters 59 to 75 and interludes 12 to 14. Kaladin is sulking in his cell and considers trying to break out. He tells Syl he no longer trusts Dalinar or any Light Eyes, liking his current situation to his time as a slave. He's becoming very bitter and miserable, and it's eating away at his bond with Syl. Wit then suddenly appears outside his cell, his thin silver sword on the bench beside him, and he tunes a musical instrument with his perfect pitch. After some banter, Wit starts playing the instrument, asking Kaladin to close his eyes and describe what he sees. Kaladin imagines a race, and as Wit sings the story of Fleet, Kaladin pictures it in his mind, and each time Wit pauses, Cal continues to add more to the story. Now, in the story, a legendary runner named Fleet, who can outrun everyone, challenges the High Storm itself to a race. He races against a high storm across the entire continent, and it almost catches him in the mountains guarding Shinovar, but he manages to stay ahead of it. His strength finally fails and he collapses, but the storm is spent as well, and it could not pass the point where he fell. And while Fleet dies, his soul then rises to win the race and ride the winds thereafter. A pretty fitting story for a windrunner. Now, Kaladin wonders what it means, but Wit says that since it's his story, he needs to decide what it means. Wit then says, the storm catches everyone, eventually. Does it matter? And leaves Kaladin to ponder. Now, in this chapter, we do have a brief Cosmere Easter egg from Warbreaker, so again, maybe skip ahead like 30 seconds if you don't want to know this spoiler. The mention of Wit's perfect pitch is a reference to the magic system from Warbreaker. In Warbreaker, you get perfect pitch from hitting the second heightening, which means that Hoid has at least 200 breaths. Shallan, looking for Urithiru, overlays the map of the Silver Kingdoms with the map of the Unclaimed Hills and the Shattered Plains, and recognizes that the hills and the plains form what was once Natan. And she makes the connection that the capital city might likely be on the pre-Shattered Plains rather than in the mountains. Now, not only is Stormseat on the plains, it seems to have been the focal point for whatever shattered them. So she believes there must be an Oathgate within the ruins of Stormseat. Little does she know, Stormseat is now the place called Exile, or Narok, and it's the home of the listeners. Now, Pattern urges Shallan to unlock repressed memories to regain her abilities and fight the Everstorm. And this is the first time Shallan actually admits that she has purposefully cut her memories off so as not to cripple herself. And suddenly an image forms in front of her, this illusion of a broken, wretched girl that she believes she would be if she let herself remember. She decides to instead turn Veil into a vision, and with some experimentation, she discovers that she can actually attach the illusion to Pattern and make it animate. Another flashback 1.5 years ago, Shallan has become the perfect daughter, keeping quiet to avoid triggering her father's violent tendencies. During an argument with Balat about his courtship of a girl named Aelita, Lyn has Balat's new Axehound pups slaughtered, and later Shallan finds Balat devastated by the death of his pups, and they discuss fleeing the house. Shallan overhears Lyn planning to have Halloran killed, offering his shard blade as payment, and her stepmother, Malise, is shocked by her husband's cruelty, leading to a very heated argument. Moving back to Kaladin, Syl mentions she saw a cryptic spren during the arena fight, hinting to Kaladin that he might not be alone much longer, as another Radiant might be forming a bond. Now, Dalinar comes to visit and tells him that he'll be released in a few days. He goes on to tell Kaladin he's not going to change anything, screaming like a lunatic and challenging men like Amaram to duels, and tells him, be the kind of man that others admire, whether they be light-eyed or dark. Convince Elhokar that a dark eyes can lead. That will change the world. However, Cal also learns that it was Elhokar's poor decision-making that inadvertently cost his family's comfortable position in Hearthstone. And after Dalinar leaves, Kaladin tells Syl he now agrees with Moash that the king must die. Back to Shallan, who's chatting with Adolin via Spanreed while hiding in one of her illusions and trying to spy on the Ghostbloods, who she also realizes are trying to spy on her. She sends Pattern to locate the spy, identifying Eotil. Shallan surprises Eotil, who gives her a task to investigate a new arrival in Dalinar's camp, a supposed madman that Dalinar and the king are interested in. Now Eotil reveals that Mraize is her student, not her master, and that she wears a mask to reserve herself and allow her to adapt. As they ride in a palanquin to investigate the madman, Shallan removes her disguise to gain entry into Dalinar's war camp, then quickly resumes her veil persona without Eotil noticing. Inside the temple, Shallan sneaks away and finds Taln, who mutters about the return of desolation. She doesn't exactly believe he's actually a herald, but she writes down his words anyway, and when she attempts to use light weaving to use the disguise of an Ardent to leave, Taln grabs her and holds her against the wall in alarm. Shallan summons her Shardblade out of fear, but doesn't end up using it, as the madman mutters about Ishar's knights, and then gives up and goes back to bed. She makes an illusion to hide herself just as Amaram and Borden enter Taln's cell, and she feels anger toward Amaram, knowing that he killed her brother. Amaram wants Borden to help him find the secret cache of Shardblades, which Amaram assumes to be the Honor Blades. Shallan then gives the transcription of Taln's rambling to Eotil and describes Amaram's visit, and Eotil is very impressed with Shallan's skill, asking who she truly is, and she simply replies that she is a seeker of truth. Later on, Mraize informs Shallan that she has proven herself and is now safe within the Ghostbloods. She's instructed to get a tattoo as a symbol of her loyalty, marking her official membership in the secret society. Flashback a year and a half ago, Shallan sneaks out of her room shortly after her father orders Helleran's assassination. She finds Balat in the garden. Following his old tendencies of destroying things, he's torturing Kremlings, and she tells him about their father's loss of control and the assassination order. They then plan for Balat and Melise to escape and warn Helleran, and inside she tends to Melise's injuries caused by Lyn. Now back to Kaladin, who's brooding in his cell, imagining himself as a failure. He's fallen deep into a depression, and Syl is becoming slightly more like a curious childlike Whitespine due to their bond likely weakening. Now suddenly a jailer informs him that he's been pardoned without a loss of rank, and as he leaves and passes another cell, he finds Adolin imprisoned by choice, refusing to be free until Kaladin was released. Now Adolin explains that it just wasn't right for Kaladin to be locked up after saving his life. They banter a bit, and the two seem to reach a mutual understanding, with Adolin saying, "I don't know if I've ever met another man who would jump unarmored into a fight among 6 Shardbearers." When Kaladin says that everything he said about Amaram was true, he's surprised when Adolin immediately believes him. Now Bridge 4 is waiting for Kaladin to celebrate his release, and Adolin presents him with a full set of shards that were left over after the arena fight, but Kaladin refuses them, and he gives the Shardblade and plate to Moash instead, making him a Light Eyes. Later, he talks privately with Moash, confirming his support for the plan to remove Elokar. Moash is pleased, and the two briefly discuss their next steps before heading to the sparring grounds and returning to a feast with Bridge 4. Now over to Dalinar, he comforts Navani, who is still grieving for Yasna, and at the evening feast, Dalinar notices people paying more attention to him, but not really letting him in on the joke. Investigating, he finds Aladar and Sadeas. They feign ignorance of any wrongdoing and leave, but Amaram arrives and tells him that someone leaked Navani's notes of his visions, and Navani reports that they have twisted the tone of her notes in order to make him look foolish. Now Dalinar stands atop a table and boldly addresses the crowd, declaring that the visions are real and that he will have them published for scholarly review. He confronts the mockery directly, quoting the Way of Kings for strength. And after, Wit speaks with him and praises his approach to the insults, but then he cryptically says, "I am but a man, Dalinar, so much as I wish it were not true at times. I am no Radiant, and while I am your friend, please understand that our goals do not completely align. You must not trust yourself with me. If I have to watch this world crumble and burn to get what I need, I will do so. With tears, yes, but I would let it happen. I will do what I can to help, and for that reason, I must go. I cannot risk too much, because if he finds me, then I become nothing. A soul shredded and broken into pieces that cannot be reassembled. What I do here is more dangerous than you could ever know. When Dalinar asks who he's referring to, Wit says, the one you fight, the father of hatred, then jogs off. Now switching to Kaladin, who's joining a scouting expedition to the Shattered Plains, and he doesn't quite realize that by offering support to the assassination of the king, he's directly violating both the first and second ideals that he's spoken so far. And he's struggling to absorb Stormlight, and Syl isn't really offering any help. He overhears a report about a glowing man who's been flying around near the chasms, whom Dalinar believes to be Szeth, but Kal is embarrassed because he knows it was actually himself. Now, as Shallan is sketching one of the mechanical bridges, he recognizes one of the carpenters, but then Moash arrives, now a Light Eyes, and he informs Kaladin that the assassination plot is nearing its final stage. Adolin and Kal have some banter together, and Adolin asks for advice on women from Kaladin of all people, and it seems like they're starting to kind of become friends, though Shallan does call Kal out when he sneakily insults Adolin without him knowing. As they carry the mobile bridges across the mechanical one, the carpenter that Kaladin recognizes triggers a collapse, and Kaladin and Shallan fall with the bridge into the chasm below. As he's falling, he absorbs Stormlight, and he hears Syl scream in pain. He then awakes in darkness and hears a voice asking, "What have you done?" He runs into Shallan nearby, and he lies about how he survived the fall, crediting Whitespine for protecting them. They search the wreckage, but they find no sign of Dalinar or Adolin among the dead Parshendi and spearmen. They realize a high storm is due the following night, so they need to try to get back to the war camp through the chasms, and they're both internally curious about how they managed to save the other. Now, Shallan can't help but notice the beauty of the plant life in the chasms, and Kaladin ignores her chatter for a while as they both start to annoy each other, and he says he doesn't like Light Eyes and brings up the incident with the boots, but then he says he actually doesn't dislike her as he does other Light Eyes, and he holds no grudge. But then he ruins his apology by insulting her and going on about how all Light Eyes are responsible for the mistreatment of the lower class, and they argue some more and then are interrupted by a scraping noise. Realizing the danger they're in, they begin to run and are chased by a Chasmfiend. No time for hesitation, he barreled down a pathway, ears full of the sound of grinding carapace. A sudden, four-voiced trump echoed through the chasm, as loud as 1,000 horns being blown. Shallan screamed, though Kaladin barely heard her over the horrible sound. Kaladin leads the mad dash, but then Shallan suddenly goes the other way, leading them back to where they first fell so they can lure the beast to the fresh corpses for food. The beast filled the chasm, long and narrow. It wasn't bulbous or bulky like some small cremlings. It was sinuous, sleek, with the arrow-like face and sharp mandibles. It was also wrong in a way difficult to describe. Big creatures were supposed to be slow and docile, like chulls. Yet this enormous beast moved with ease, its legs up on the sides of the chasm, holding it so that its body barely touched the ground. It ate the corpse of a fallen soldier, grasping the body in smaller claws by its mouth, then ripping it in half with a gruesome bite. That face was like something from a nightmare. Evil, powerful, almost intelligent. They then try to get as far away as possible, and Kaladin decides they should wait until daybreak to avoid getting lost. The two banter a bit, and Shallan impresses Kaladin with her sketching ability, creating a map of the chasms. Now, the next morning, they set out, and still bantering, though Shallan reveals her serious side when explaining her mission to continue Yasna's research and prevent disaster. Now, Kal tells her about his suspicions of her, but eventually he accepts that she means no harm to the Kholins. At one point, Kaladin again makes some blind assumption about Shallan having a perfect cozy life, and if only he knew how far from the truth that is. After a while, they realize they've been going in the wrong direction. We then briefly switch over to Teft's perspective. While Dalinar believes Kaladin to be dead, Teft is confident that he's alive and is going to return. Teft then recounts his tragic childhood. His parents were invisagers, which basically means he was raised in a cult that believed if they could bring back the return of the Voidbringers, it could trigger the return of the Knights Radiant. Meanwhile, back in the chasms, Kaladin calls out for Syl, but gets no response. He's impressed when Shallan draws an accurate and detailed map from memory, and Kaladin mentions how the plateaus are symmetrical, saying he saw it in a dream. And Shallan has an epiphany that the Shattered Plains were artificially created through cymatics. This breakthrough means she knows exactly where the Oathgate is. Now, Kaladin smiles and jokes with her, and they have some good banter, but then later he goes back to being gloomy, and he worries about Syl and blames himself for their situation. Now, Shallan actually opens up enough to let him know that she has felt pain and crushing guilt, and Kaladin realizes he's not alone. The crushing guilt of being powerless, of wishing they'd hurt you instead of those around you, of screaming and scrambling and hating as those you love are ruined, popped like a boil, and you have to watch their joy seeping away while you can't do anything. They break the ones you love and not you, and you plead, "Can't you just beat me instead?" He saw it in her eyes, the anguish, the frustration, the terrible nothing that clawed inside and sought to smother her. She knew it was there, inside. She had been broken. Then she smiled. Oh, storms, she smiled anyway. It was the single most beautiful thing he'd seen in his entire life. And then the Chasmfiend appears again, forcing them to hide in a small crack in the wall of the cavern where it can't reach. Now Kaladin decides to distract the creature, hoping to buy some time for Shallan to escape and bring her vital information back to the camp. He prepares to fight the Chasmfiend and tells Shallan to apologize to Adolin on his behalf, but then Shallan offers him her shard blade, brushing off his questions and swearing him to secrecy. Kaladin, feeling no screams when touching the blade, reluctantly accepts it, and as she retrieves her satchel, Kaladin distracts the Chasmfiend, managing to wound it, but he's much slower without Stormlight, and eventually he gets bitten in the leg and collapses from pain. And desperate, he tries to use Stormlight, but only hears weeping. Shallan creates an illusion to distract the beast, giving Cal the moment he needs to thrust the blade through the Chasmfiend's mouth and into its brain, killing it. Only now he's trapped in its mouth, so Shallan summons the blade and cuts him loose. She then binds his wounds and cuts a ladder into the chasm wall and a tiny cave for them to shelter from the rest of the high storm. Flashback 1 year ago, Shallan and her siblings prepare for Balat's escape with his lover Aelita. Their plan unravels though when Lyn summons them to the feast hall, and panicking, Shallan collects a pouch of poison, Blackbane, and heads to confront her father. In the hall, Lyn reveals that Helleran is dead, and he coldly declares he knows of their escape plan. Now nearby, Shallan discovers her stepmother's beaten body blocking the kitchen. Balat draws his sword, followed by Lyn, and they clash brutally. Meanwhile, Shallan slips the Blackbane into a cup of wine, and after Balat is disarmed, her father grabs the cup and drinks the wine. He then grabs an iron poker from the fireplace and slams it down on Balat's leg over and over before suddenly stumbling to his knees. The poison paralyzes him, but doesn't kill him. Jushu pulls a soulcaster out from Lyn's pocket, which was apparently broken during the fight, and reluctantly, Shallan strangles him with her necklace, whispering a lullaby as her father dies. Back in the chasms, the high storm pounds the plateaus and floodwater rises quickly, causing bloated bodies to float to the surface. As they huddle against the rock, Kaladin recounts how Sadeas left him to die in a high storm and tells the story of his enslavement, his time in Bridge 4, and the battle with the Parshendi Shardbearer. And during his tale, he sees strange spren like lightning, but red and violet, and hears chanting in the storm. He also swears that he sees an enormous figure walking on the plateau above, a glowing, inhuman form followed by more. Now, Shallan also confesses that she killed her father and shares her traumatic past. Well, some of it anyway, and Kaladin realizes that Halloran, her brother, was the shard-bearer that he killed in Elithkar in the Way of Kings, but he keeps it to himself. He realizes his life could have been much worse, and at least he was raised with parents that loved him. As the storm intensifies, Cal has a vision where a massive face appears in the storm and tells him that he has killed Sylphrena and that it can't be fixed.
She is broken. You are like the ones who came before, the ones who killed so many of those I love. Farewell, son of honor. You will not ride my winds again.
When the vision ends, Shallan reveals that she saw the same face in the storm. Switching to Dalinar, Amaram urges him to make peace with Sadeas before the expedition, but Dalinar believes the opportunity to reconcile with Sadeas is long gone. Now suddenly a messenger arrives with news that Kaladin has returned from the chasms. And as Cal is receiving treatment, despite his injuries, he stands to salute Dalinar, and he reports that he survived with the help of Spren and brought Shallan back safely. He also presents a gem heart from the Chasmfiend they encountered, but Shallan quickly adds that the Chasmfiend was already dead when they found it, in order to avoid questions. Then Navani arrives, and she seems to almost adopt Shallan. As it turns out, she was actually very worried for her. Dalinar asks if Kaladin is the man that he's been searching for, and Kaladin replies that he once was, but not anymore. Now Adolin arrives, embracing Shallan with a kiss, and he apologizes for rescuing his father instead of her, but Shallan is stressed by her memories, and she assures him that she doesn't need protection and will never allow herself to be locked away again. Dalinar invites her to join the expedition, and she's set on going, believing the ancient city that Yasna was searching for is in the Shattered Plains, and they plan to depart within the hour. And then we have Interlude 12. Pi, a devout ardent, is assigned to work under Brother Lan in Kholinar to join Queen Aesudan's retinue. Lan explains that the queen likes to feel religiously devout, though she lives extravagantly while many Alethi starve. And Lan tries to convince Pi to be less confrontational and to fit in with the queen's more lax religious lifestyle. Pi reluctantly agrees to fit in, but the next day, Lan arrives at the palace to find that Pi has painted the throne room with large glyphs depicting the 10 foolish attributes. Symbolizing the queen embodies them. Pi is then executed for her defiance, sparking riots in the city. Interlude 13. Eshonai, trying to suppress the screaming inside her, discusses the upcoming Alethi attack with Venli, suggesting they surprise their enemies by summoning a high storm that moves in the opposite direction. Eshonai is uneasy about how comfortable Venli and the scholars are with storm form, but she continues training soldiers for the upcoming battle, determined to proceed with the plan. And then Interlude 14. Taravangian awakes on a ship. His attendants test his cognitive abilities, finding him fit to make decisions without supervision. Taravangian then contemplates the difficulty of his life, waking up with a different level of intelligence each day, especially as the world's fate may depend on him. He arrives near Vedinar, where his forces tend the wounded from the civil war, and exhausted soldiers cheer for his mercy, though little do they know he engineered the entire conflict. In this interlude, we learn Taravangian is getting his plans and orders from something called the Diagram, something he wrote on his most brilliant day ever, a gift from the Night Watcher. He discusses with his head scribe, Adrotagia, about the thrill and the influence of some being called Nergal. Then Szeth appears, demanding to speak with Taravangian, and Szeth reveals that Dalinar has a surge binder, which alarms Taravangian, who had thought that Yasna was the only one. He tells Szeth his opponent must have had an honor blade, and then he instructs him to avoid that one but to kill Dalinar. Later, Taravangian visits the dying king Valam, who names him his heir. Now, Valam is shocked to learn that all the other high princes are dead. He orders his son Redin to stab him in the heart, ending his misery. Now, as Valam dies, he utters a death rattle, and Taravangian mentions Moloch, another unmade being that's responsible for the death rattles. Taravangian feels satisfied, knowing he's following the diagram's plan and moving closer to unifying the world as Gavilar had envisioned. Now, this time around, the epigraphs of Part 4, when pieced together, form a response to the letter of the epigraphs in Part 2 of The Way of Kings. So I would recommend going back and reading the first letter before reading this response. Now, the letter goes on to talk about the severe danger of someone named Raze and how he bears the weight of God's own divine hatred. Now, the author of the letter says that Raze is what we made him to be and fears he's more of a force than an individual now, but goes on to say that he's contained. Now, the author then pleads that the recipient joins their oath of non-intervention, claiming the Cosmere itself may depend upon your restraint. Is not the destruction we have wrought enough? The worlds you now tread bear the touch and design of Adonalsium. Our interference so far has brought nothing but pain. Now, obviously, there's some big Cosmere significance to this letter, so skip ahead to Part 5 if you don't want to know. This letter, you guessed it, is directed towards Hoid, and the one writing the letter is likely Hoid's old friend named Frost. Now, we don't know too much about Frost at the moment that's canon, because he's from the yet unpublished Dragonsteel novel. But again, check out my video on the shattering of Adonalsium for more details. But it's clear from the letter that Frost is still feeling guilt for being involved in the shattering. Now, Raze, if you didn't pick up on this or you just need a reminder, is the shard holder of Odium, and he's got a tendency of killing other shards. Now, he's somehow restricted to the Rosharan system, seeming to do with something that Tanavas did, and right now he can't destroy any more shards. Also, the gemstone mentioned at the beginning of the letter is likely a topaz. Sanderson has mentioned that Hoid has a topaz with magical properties. And that ends Part 4. Moving on to Part 5, Winds a Light. This covers chapters 76 to 89 and the Epilogue. We've finally made it to the last stretch, but there's a lot to cover here. Kaladin is unable to sleep and he's haunted by thoughts that he killed Syl. He tells Lopin he wants to watch the army depart, and Lopin, concerned, asks why Kaladin doesn't use Stormlight to heal, and this is where Kaladin admits that he lost his powers and that Syl is gone. And Lopin, bless his heart, tries to encourage him to reconnect with Syl. They then go off to watch Bridgeford depart on the expedition. Now switching to Dalinar, who's surprised to see that Seberial is bringing his army and joining the expedition. And Seberial explains that he sees opportunities on the plains and wants to arrive before High Prince Aladar. Meanwhile, Sadeas is frustrated by this, but believes he can seize power when everyone inevitably dies on the expedition. Dalinar spots Kaladin and approaches with Amaram, hoping to address the rumors Kaladin spread about the man. Dalinar asks Amaram to confirm that he never met Kaladin and didn't steal his shards. Obviously, Amaram lies, and Dalinar then confronts Amaram with the truth, revealing a sting operation that proved Amaram's guilt. He finally confesses and says he acted for the greater good, believing the Voidbringer's return justified his actions. Dalinar strips Amaram of his title, promising he will face justice later, and Cal thanks Dalinar for believing him. Now later, during the weeping, Kaladin is miserable without Syl. Moash visits, explaining the plan to kill Elokar, assuring Kaladin he won't need to be directly involved. Now over to Shallan, Gaz delivers her a copy of Words of Radiance, And the book explains the orders of the Knights Radiant and their abilities, though much of it is based on hearsay. Now she wonders if more Surgebinders will begin to appear, and Navani joins her and apologizes for neglecting her. They bond over shared feelings of inadequacy compared to Yasna, then they discuss plans to locate Stormseat and open the Oathgate. Shallan reveals that Yasna could soulcast without a Fabrial, and this alarms Navani as she links the Radiance to the return of the Voidbringers. Now Dalinar comes to speak with Shallan and questions her about Yasna's research about the return of the Knights Radiant, recounting his goal to refound the Order. Now Shallan says, what if your task wasn't to refound the Knights Radiant, but to gather them? She then breathes in Stormlight and breathes it back out in a shimmering cloud that forms into a small image of Yasna standing atop her open palm, revealing that she's a Surgebinder, and Dalinar is in complete awe. They're interrupted by news of Parshendi sightings, and Shallan insists on joining Dalinar, though she asks for it to remain a secret. They inspect a dead Parshendi with red eyes, when another Parshendi approaches the camp, one who's not attacking, and it's revealed to be Rlain, the Parshendi member of Bridge 4, and he surrenders. Now Dalinar and Navani interrogate Rlain, noting his appearance differs from the regular Parshmen. Rlain reveals that he was a spy for the Parshendi for about 3 years, using doll form to blend in as a Parshman slave. And he goes on further to say that something has changed with Eshonai, and that his friends among the listeners have become monsters. And despite feeling lost, Rock and Scar assure him that he's still part of Bridge 4. Rlain explains the red eyes signify the return of the Parshendi's gods, ancient beings full of hatred for the Alethi. Rlain is then placed under the custody of Bridge 4 and tasked with helping guide the Alethi against his own people. Later on, Shallan and Gaz climb a rock formation to survey the ruins of an ancient city, and upon reluctantly returning, Dalinar decides they're going to march the next day to confront the Parshendi after Adolin reports spotting 10,000 of them nearby. Shallan tells Dalinar and Navani that the Oathgate is real, and they consider using it for an emergency escape route. Now in this chapter, we get this art piece revealing that Naz has somehow acquired a copy of Shallan's map of the plains. It really makes you wonder if he's tagging along in the background during this expedition. Maybe he's still disguised as an Ardent. Also, I should note that the last comment on this map where he says, "But shadows, woman," this is what identifies Naz's home planet as Threnody, the world of shadows for silence in the Forest of Hell, which I'd highly recommend reading. Now back at the war camp, Elhokar waits in the barracks and confesses his incompetence to Kaladin. He wants to know how Kaladin became a hero, and Kal is pretty rude to him here and suggests that he should resign, which obviously angers the king. At one point, Elhokar does admit that since Kaladin's arrival, the shadows that haunted him have vanished. He apologizes for imprisoning him, acknowledging that his jealousy caused his poor decisions. And then later, Kaladin is still injured, but he goes and visits Xyle in the training grounds. He vaguely shares his dilemma, and Xyle advises him to choose the path that allows him to sleep best at night, claiming that's what he wished he had done. Now, when Kaladin asks him if he knows where the king's wit is, Xyle calls him a fool, and oddly calls him by the name Dust. Now, mild Easter egg here, this nickname is likely a result of the storytelling method Hoid used in Warbreaker, involving colorful dust or sand. Eventually, reflecting on his younger brother, Kal has the sudden realization that Elhokar is Dalinar's TN. Speaking of Dalinar, he's observing the Parshendi with glowing red eyes, and he gives a motivational speech to nearby soldiers, saying that he was sent from the Almighty with knowledge of what they face from visions of the past, and to trust that the Voidbringers will be countered by the Radiance. As the Parshendi begins singing, Rlain warns that the song is of death and destruction, and says they need to stop the song or else. With the mysterious countdown now at its end, Dalinar commands the army to attack immediately. Adolin leads a charge against the Parshendi, but his group is hit by lightning that kills Adolin's Rishadium horse, Sureblood. Thrown from the saddle, he's protected by his shard plate and continues the charge, killing Parshendi and watching red spren leave their bodies. Eventually, they try to block his movement by using ropes. And this is where he notices the singing Parshendi are not joining, so he decides to go after the singers. Meanwhile, Shallan sketches a map to locate the Oathgate, and a scout named Lyn mentions that Shim and Felt are scouting but should be back soon. Now take a note of the name Felt. He seems to kind of pop up here and there, especially more so in the next two books. Another interesting detail is the scout Lyn is actually named after Lindsay Luther, one of Sanderson's beta readers, and a moderator for the Stormlight Archive subreddit, who happens to be something of a cartographer herself as well as a writer. I just thought this was so cool. Now eventually they notice an unnatural, perfectly round plateau that stands out from the rest, and Pattern warns that something is very wrong and identifies the red spren as dangerous void spren, all while Renarin studies Pattern closely. Now Dalinar orders Renarin to escort Shallan with a group of soldiers to that plateau, and as Dalinar walks, he's startled to hear the familiar voice from his visions. The Almighty says, "I am sorry that you have to die this way." But then the voice clarifies it's not the Almighty, but rather a sliver of him left over after Odium killed him. Dalinar takes his horse and reports to Navani to activate her plan immediately. A line of archers protected by Fabrials begin to target the Parshendi surrounding Roaion's troops. And then we move back to Kaladin, who's still injured but rushes to the palace to protect Elokar. He encounters two strangers in Bridge 4 uniforms, working for Graves. He ambushes them, knocking them out, and finds Elokar lying motionless. Thankfully, he's alive, but rather drunk. Now Kaladin helps him flee, and as they leave, one of Graves' men stabs Elokar, injuring him, but not fatally. Cal kills the attacker and urges the king to not give up, telling him that Fleet kept running. He tries to elaborate more to the groggy king about the story of Fleet, and eventually says, "We all die in the end, you see, so I guess what truly matters is just how well you've run. And Elokar, you've kept running since your father was killed, even if you screw up all the storming time." Then Moash and Graves appear, both in Shardplate, and Moash tries to convince him to let Elokar die, arguing that the king's death is justified. But Kaladin refuses, saying Moash is betraying Bridge 4 by taking this dishonorable route. Cutting back to Shallan, who along with Renarin and the bridgemen and soldiers arrive at a deserted circular plateau near the battle. She explains this must be where the Oathgate is because it seems to be the center from which the Shattered Plains was broken. Now Renarin says the wind is blowing the wrong way, signaling the Everstorm. They begin searching the area and eventually cut into a large rock mound, revealing a hidden chamber. And inside, Shallan sees intricate murals and a room suggesting it's tied to the Oathgate's mechanism. Now, Renarin's blade doesn't activate the gate, and as Shallan tries to decipher the puzzle of the Oathgate, Pattern warns her that the coming Everstorm will collide with a high storm, creating an unprecedented catastrophic event. With time running out, Shallan orders the bridgemen to prepare the armies for an immediate evacuation. Renarin cryptically talks about seeing the future and warns that the end is near, and he also seems oddly relieved whenever he dismisses his shard blade. Meanwhile, Adolin, after also cutting through a rock with his shard blade, enters an ancient chamber behind the Parshendi lines. Along with his troops, he ambushes the singing Parshendi from behind, and he feels disgusted by the ease of the killing, noticing the absence of the usual thrill. And then Eshonai attacks him, and Adolin eagerly summons his blade again to face a worthy opponent. He duels Eshonai, who believes she's winning, but Adolin sacrifices pieces of his armor, managing to knock her back into a chasm. And as Adolin almost falls with her, Scar and Drehi, along with other soldiers, pull him back from the chasm. After returning to the central plateau, he's suddenly confronted by Szeth, who is disguised as a cloaked messenger. Now Dalinar hears the voice of the Stormfather again, explaining that the Parshendi are summoning the Everstorm, and all he can do is make a storm of cleansing to wash away their bodies. Dalinar is angered and denounces the Stormfather for abandoning them, and then the Stormfather cryptically mentions he must leave because his daughter is disobeying, and he says Dalinar will see no further visions. Back to Kaladin, who's being overpowered by Moash, his ribs broken by a shard-enhanced punch. And as Moash and Graves prepare to frame Szeth for the king's assassination, Kaladin, in immense pain and feeling at the end of his race, hears a distant argument between Sylphrena and the Stormfather. He reflects on the first ideal and what it means to be a Windrunner, and he realizes it's his duty to protect even those he despises. And as he struggles to rise, he speaks his next oath. I will protect even those I hate, so long as it is right. Syl instructs him to put out his hand, and a glowing, brilliant shard blade emerges, with swirling patterns along its length glowing with vivid blue light. Kaladin heals himself, and frost crystallizes on the ground, growing from behind him and forming a glyph, almost the shape of wings. He declares the Knights Radiant have returned. Graves screams, realizing the diagram predicted this, but too late to stop it. The men flee, and Kaladin realizes Dalinar may also be in danger. Dalinar, receiving Shallan's report about the two storms colliding, decides to relocate to Shallan's position for safety. Suddenly, Adolin crashes through the tent, badly injured and missing part of his shard plate, and as Dalinar looks up, the assassin in white walks in. Holding his son, he prepares for what may be his final moments. He advises Adolin on leadership, telling him he's a good man. Dalinar dismisses Bridge 4 and asks Szeth why he killed Gavilar, and Szeth responds,
I am Szeth, Son Vallano, truthless of Shinovar. I do as my masters demand, and I do not ask for explanations.
Dalinar, now bonded to the madman's blade, fights Szeth, and Szeth, noticing the sword, smiles wickedly as he strikes. He breaks Dalinar's ribs, and Dalinar feels peace, realizing he never could have saved Gavilar. He couldn't have beaten this monster. High Prince Roion intervenes, but Szeth sends him hurtling into the sky before killing a dozen more soldiers. Adolin, now unarmed, joins the fight, but Szeth sends Dalinar flying into the sky and breaks Adolin's wrist. Before Adolin is killed, Dalinar descends from the sky, streaming white light. And Kaladin, like a falling star, crashes to the ground with his shard blade, leaving another glowing glyph behind.
You sent him to the sky to die, assassin, but the sky and the winds are mine. I claim them, as I now claim your life.
Szeth is horrified, and Teft and Bridge 4 throw infused gems to Kaladin for Stormlight. Kaladin charges at Szeth, furious and determined to avenge his fallen comrades. Now Dalinar acknowledges that Kaladin is what he was looking for and prepares to fit everyone on the plateau to escape through the portal. And Adolin, with a massive smile on his face, is dumbstruck that the Bridge Boy is a Radiant. When he makes his way over to Shallan and sees her openly showing her abilities by infusing stones of the chamber and glowing with stormlight, Adolin is again happily shocked and wonders if she can also fly. Now Shallan has realized the entire chamber is an enormous fabrial, and discovers that regular shard blades won't power the fabrial, only hers will. She summons Pattern as a blade and inserts it into the keyhole, unlocking the Oath Gate. They walk to the mural of Urithiru, and after cutting a hole in the wall, it's revealed they've been transported to the mountain range housing the ancient city. Now back to Kaladin, who's flying through the air chasing Szeth, and Syl reveals that she was only as dead as his broken oaths. Szeth accuses him of stealing an honor blade, but Kaladin denies it. The two engage in a fierce battle in the sky, with Syl shifting between various weapon forms to help Kaladin parry and strike. All while tons of windspren dance and spiral around him. The wind is mine. The sky is mine. They have been mine since childhood. You are the trespasser here, not me. Szeth stabs Kaladin, but he heals the wound using Stormlight, and they both recharge their investiture in the storm, with Syl warning Kaladin to be careful as this is the Stormfather's domain, and he kinda hates Kal at this point. Szeth, trying to find Dalinar, is baffled that the army below has mysteriously vanished. Realizing they've gone to Urithiru, he hurls himself west, with Kaladin trying his best to follow. They break through the storm front, and Kaladin stabs Szeth in the foot and lands a few more blows. Szeth, in disbelief, finally acknowledges the truth. The Radiants are back, and he was never truthless. He could have stopped the murdering at any time. Kaladin stabs him through the chest and grabs his honor blade as the Shin Man falls. Now Syl explains that the second storm is not of their making, but comes from something worse. And she explains that shard blades are dead spren, but they gain a little life when summoned. And Szeth's blade is not the same. It's an honor blade, granting Windrunner powers, but at a dangerously high cost of stormlight. She explains the honor blades are what shard blades are based on. Honor gave them to men, and Spren figured out what he'd done and imitated it by making the shard blades. Now Kaladin encounters Bridge 4, including Rock and Teft, who confirm that the army was transported by Shallan, but they were left behind. At this point, Kaladin can't hide his abilities anymore because his eyes have now turned light, and he's surprised to see that R'lain has a new form. Teft oddly mentions how some of the other lads were glowing with stormlight just before Kaladin arrived, then he gives the brilliant line, "You can't protect us all, son. You can't stop people from feeling pain. Can't stop men from dying." Kal then uses Syl to operate the Fabrial and transport the group. Now, meanwhile, Shallan surveys Urithiru as people explain the newly discovered city. Pattern tells her that she's close to becoming a full Radiant, and she checks with Dalinar, who reports that Elokar is missing and Kholinar is in chaos. Kaladin meets up with them along with Bridge 4, and he's carrying Szeth's shard blade, and he reports that Szeth is dead and Elokar is safe in a secret location. We then get the point of view of Lopen, who's experimenting with an infused gemstone as his mother tells Elokar to eat more chowda. He's amazed to find that new flesh suddenly begins growing where his missing arm was. Then overjoyed, he demands more spheres from his family, celebrating his ability to use Stormlight. The Lopen is a legend. We then get the point of view of Moash, who rides in a cart leaving the war camps, and he's filled with guilt over betraying Kaladin and failing to kill the king. Graves joins him, explaining he interpreted the diagram incorrectly and that Yasna was right about the Voidbringers. He tells Moash that he'll bring him into the diagram and that they have important work ahead in saving the world. And though Moash feels he's being manipulated, he follows Graves, preparing for what lies ahead. Now, as Shallan explores Urithiru, she finds a folded note with the Ghostbloods symbol, and to her alarm, her real name. She enters a room where Mraize is waiting for her. Now, Mraize reveals that she exposed herself by using her powers during the battle, suggesting that Veil is her true identity. He then explains the Ghostbloods' interest in her family. He threatens her with her brother's safety, and then he says there's answers that she needs to learn about the Ghostbloods' purpose and what her brother and father were up to. He tells her she can be both a Radiant and a Ghostblood, and offers her time to decide whether to join their ranks. Now, she then finds Adolin and they share a light moment, then she returns to her quarters, and Pattern says it's time to finally become Radiant and acknowledge the truth. Shallan experiences an illusion. She's pushing the painting aside and opens the lockbox to find Pattern in blade form. It turns out her mother had tried to kill Shallan when she learned what she could do. Shallan was forced to kill her mother in self-defense, and her father took the blame, leading to the family's downfall. When Pattern reminds her that she can eventually seek revenge, Shallan says she doesn't want revenge, she just wants her family. Flashing over briefly to Amaram, he writes a report to Rastaris about the Voidbringer's return and the new storm. Believing this crisis will lead to the Heralds and Church regaining dominance, he reflects on the Sons of Honor's success and his broken friendship with Dalinar. He then cuts his way into the room holding the Madman Taln, and while he attempts to lead him out of the room, Amaram narrowly avoids a poison dart assassination attempt thanks to Taln's reflexes. When the attacker flees, Amaram escorts Taln to safety. And then the point of view of Szeth. Szeth awakens, confused as to why he's not dead. Nail, Herald of Justice, stands before him, claiming to be one of Szeth's gods. He calls Szeth his apprentice and offers him a chance to join the Skybreakers. Now Szeth, in despair, expresses a desire to die, but then changes his mind, realizing he was right and his people were wrong all along. Nail says he will teach him to ignore feelings and bring justice to his former leaders, and presents him with a strange sheathed shard blade. And as Szeth picks it up, a trail of black smoke coming from the blade, he hears a voice say,
"Hello, would you like to destroy some evil today?"
And oh boy, this is a massive Cosmere reveal. Now I sure hope you have read Warbreaker. If not, skip ahead. Here we see the return of an old friend, the sentient sword Nightblood. It really makes you wonder how Nightblood got separated from Vasher. Is Zyle looking for it? Who knows? And then we have the final chapter. While exploring Urithiru, Adolin feels overwhelmed with Shallan's change in status and ends up encountering Sadeas, who boasts about undermining Dalinar, saying he will take this city from him. Realizing they're all alone, Adolin violently attacks Sadeas, stabbing him in the skull. Then shaken, he takes the Shardblade, Oathbringer, and drops it out a window and removes all traces of his presence. Switching to Dalinar, he's having this beautiful vision of his childhood home, and the strange dream is unlike any of the other visions he's had before. Is he possibly somehow accessing the spiritual realm? Now, people are arriving at the tower, making their way by the map that was sent out, while Dalinar climbs to the roof of Urithiru and confronts the Stormfather, who reveals that he is the Spren of the Almighty, not his soul. Dalinar speaks the first oath of the Radiance and the oath of a bondsmith. "I will unite instead of divide, Stormfather. I will bring men together." The Stormfather reluctantly bonds to him. However, he refuses to become a Shardblade and warns Dalinar that they are heading towards destruction. Now, Dalinar vows to fight Odium, believing if the Almighty can be killed, so can Odium. He later joins Shallan and Kaladin at the very top of the tower, with its 10 pillars representing the 10 Oath Gates and the central pillar, Urithiru itself. Dalinar demonstrates his ability to draw stormlight, healing his injuries. Shallan exclaims that there's now 3 knights, but then she's corrected by Renarin, who walks in and reveals himself to be a Truth Watcher. Dalinar then explains that the Parchmen are being transformed by the Everstorm, and Kaladin decides he needs to return home to warn his family. Dalinar and Shallan then recite the first ideal, preparing for the task of saving as many lives as possible. Now, before getting to the epilogue that has a massive reveal, I want to point out the epigraphs all throughout part 5 are excerpts from the diagram. And again, the diagram, it's a guide to engineering the survival of humanity through the true desolation, and it was created by Taravangian on a day of superhuman intelligence. Now, some of these are very cryptic, and there's a lot of interesting details here, so it's worth reading these over again if you haven't. And now to end on the epilogue, Wit has an esoteric discussion with himself about art and beauty, and a ring of light spins before him before Yasna appears, returning from the cognitive realm. She summons a Shardblade and points it at Wit, who seems unconcerned. She asks how he found her, and Wit replies that she's been making quite a disturbance on the other side, saying it's been a long time since the Spren had to put up with someone alive alive, let alone someone so demanding as Jasnah. Now, Jasnah was able to learn some things from the High Spren regarding previous desolations. Unfortunately, she also learned that things are happening differently this time, which means that the information she sought at Urithiru may not be as useful as she anticipated. Wit reveals that when she was away, the Everstorm has arrived, Urithiru has been located, and the Knights Radiant has been refounded. He talks with her about the nature of God, noting that while Tanavast, or the Almighty, is definitely not God, though for Roshar purposes, he was a god. And then, as they walk back to what's left of civilization, Wit offers to work with Jasnah and pool their knowledge. And then at the end of the epilogue, we get this image with a note from Naz. Now apparently he's gained access to Navani's journal and reproduced the Ketik on its cover, drawn in the shape of two storms crashing together. Now if you forgot, a Ketik is a form of Holy Vorin poetry which reads the same forward and backward, and it's divisible into 5 sections. Now I should also note that, just like with the Way of Kings, the titles of all 5 parts in the book make up a Ketik of its own. And that ends Book 2 in the Stormlight Archive, Words of Radiance. And there we have it. That is my summary for Words of Radiance. I'm finally done this video. It took so long, but let me know in the comments if this was too in-depth or if it was just the right amount. Let me know your thoughts in the comments because I am working on my Oathbringer summary right now.